It began with a man who never looked like a warrior. Dwight Eisenhower had no dramatic scars, no booming voice, no violent temper that bent rooms to his will. He didn't storm through hallways or shout over strategy boards. He wasn't the kind of figure legends rush to write about. He was calm, measured, disciplined, almost gentle. And yet, in the darkest years of the 20th century, when entire nations trembled and the world seemed to tilt toward chaos, it was this quiet man who would hold the fate of millions in the steady grip of his hands. He didn't seek power. He didn't crave spotlight. He never believed he was chosen. He simply believed in the weight of responsibility and carried it with a strength few saw coming. When Eisenhower walked into command rooms, the war shifted. Papers rustled differently. Generals straightened. Maps seemed heavier. He had a way of listening that felt like patience, but was really calculation. He had a way of speaking that felt soft, but was built from steel. Eisenhower understood something few leaders ever master, that wars are not just fought with armies, but with egos, alliances, tempers, fears, doubts, and the fragile thread of trust that holds coalitions together. And the coalition he led was the largest in human history. But long before he became Supreme Commander, long before he signed his name onto plans that would drag an entire continent back into the light, Eisenhower was just a boy in Kansas, a boy who learned discipline from hard work, who studied until the candle burned low, who grew up believing that leadership was less about shouting orders and more about earning respect. He never imagined that one day the world would look to him to decide when to launch the greatest amphibious invasion it had ever seen. He never imagined that he would have to weigh weather, tides, morale, casualty estimates, and the trembling pulse of hope across occupied Europe. He never imagined that his signature would begin a day that changed the fate of civilization. But war does not ask whether a man is ready. It asks whether he is steady. And Eisenhower was steady. As the Allies prepared for the invasion of Europe, chaos swirled around him. British and American commanders argued. Politicians whispered. Intelligence contradicted itself. Weather reports collapsed into confusion. Every decision felt like a thread that could snap at any moment. But Eisenhower absorbed each piece, one by one, holding them as if they were fragile stones he had to balance in both hands. He worried constantly. He doubted himself quietly. He studied every outcome, every consequence, every life that hung in the balance. And when the final moment came, when the storm clouds lifted just enough to reveal a narrow window, he made the decision that would echo through the ages, to go. He knew the cost. He accepted it. He wrote a note accepting full blame if the landings failed. Then he tucked it into his pocket and went out to meet the men whose lives he was sending into that storm. That was Eisenhower. Not the myth, not the president he would later become, the man who carried the war's heaviest responsibilities with a quiet strength that never demanded applause. Tonight, we return to him, to the rooms where he studied maps under dim lights, to the tents where he sat alone with doubts too heavy for any single human to hold, to the streets of Europe where his decisions shaped history step by step, to the legacy of a leader who fought a war not with spectacle, but with steadiness. Before we move deeper into his story, I want to ask you something gentle in your own words. Where are you listening from tonight, and what does the quiet around you feel like? Warm? Still? Heavy? Peaceful? I want to picture the moment with you. And something else more emotional. When you think about responsibility in your own life, big or small, is there someone who taught you how to carry it? A parent, a mentor, a friend, someone you watched and learned from? You don't have to explain why they matter. Just their name is enough. And one more invitation, unique to this documentary, Eisenhower believed true strength shows most in calm moments rather than loud ones. Think of a time when you stayed calm even though everything around you was shaking. If you want, tell me what that moment taught you about yourself. And if these long, slow journeys into history help you breathe deeper, relax your mind, or drift towards sleep, consider subscribing. November 11th, 1918, Camp Colt, Pennsylvania. 27-year-old Captain Dwight David Eisenhower stood in the mud watching his tank corps prepare for deployment to France. He had trained these men for months, drilling them on tactics he'd only read about in manuals, preparing them for a war he'd never seen. The orders had finally arrived. They would ship out tomorrow. Then a messenger arrived on horseback, telegram in hand. The war was over. Germany had surrendered. Eisenhower walked back to his quarters alone, removed his boots, and sat in silence. While other officers his age had earned medals and glory in the trenches of France, he had spent the war training soldiers in central Pennsylvania. He had never heard a shot fired in anger. This moment of disappointment would define the next 2 decades of Eisenhower's life. The army he had joined in 1915 as a young West Point graduate was now contracting violently. Officers who had commanded battalions in combat were being promoted, while Eisenhower remained frozen at the rank of major. Year after year, he watched younger men advance past him. By 1936, he had spent 16 years at the same rank, a humiliation that drove many of his contemporaries to resign their commissions and seek civilian work. Eisenhower considered it constantly. The army of the 1920s and 30s was a study in frustration. A force of barely 100,000 men scattered across remote posts, practicing for wars that seemed increasingly unlikely. Officers passed time playing cards, maintaining equipment that was obsolete even by World War I standards, and wondering if they had wasted their lives on a dying profession. Yet Eisenhower possessed something his superiors noticed, even if they couldn't quite articulate what it was. He had graduated first in his class at the Command and General Staff School at Fort Leavenworth in 1926, demonstrating a gift for seeing the entire battlefield rather than just his small piece of it. When other officers focused on tactics, Eisenhower thought strategically. When they worried about their own units, he considered how different branches of the military could work together. General Fox Connor, under whom Eisenhower served in Panama in the early 20s, recognized this quality and became his mentor. Connor predicted that another world war was inevitable and that Eisenhower would play a significant role in it. At the time, stuck at a remote post in Central America, the prediction seemed absurd. But Connor taught Eisenhower to think about war as a political and diplomatic endeavour, not just a military one. This education would prove more valuable than any battlefield experience. The 1930s brought new humiliations. Eisenhower was assigned to serve under General Douglas MacArthur in the Philippines from 1935 to 1939. MacArthur was brilliant, vain, and impossible to work with. He treated Eisenhower as a subordinate clerk rather than a thinking partner. The two men clashed constantly over strategy, with MacArthur dismissing Eisenhower's concerns about Japanese aggression and Philippine defense capabilities. Eisenhower wrote in his diary that working for MacArthur was an education in dramatics, a diplomatic way of saying his commander was more concerned with his own image than with practical military matters. When Eisenhower finally returned to the United States in 1939, he was 48 years old, still a lieutenant colonel, and had spent nearly a quarter century in uniform without ever leading men in combat. His career appeared to be ending exactly as it had begun, in obscurity. Then came September 1st, 1939. German forces invaded Poland. Britain and France declared war. Eisenhower watched newsreels of German tanks smashing through Polish defences with a combination of horror and fascination. This was mobile warfare on a scale no one had imagined, combining tanks, aircraft, and infantry in coordinated operations that made World War I tactics look medieval. The Blitzkrieg, as journalists were calling it, represented everything Eisenhower had been studying in theory but had never seen in practice. As Europe erupted into total war, Eisenhower remained at Fort Lewis, Washington, training troops who might never see combat. He wrote to his wife Mamie, expressing his frustration. Officers younger than him were already commanding divisions. He was 50 years old and had never heard a shot fired in anger. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, changed everything. The United States was suddenly at war with Japan, and within days, with Germany and Italy as well. 5 days after Pearl Harbor, Eisenhower received a phone call ordering him to report to Washington immediately. He had no idea why he was being summoned, but he packed a bag and took the first train east. When he arrived at the War Department, he was ushered into the office of General George C. Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff. Marshall looked up from his desk and asked a simple question. What should be our general line of action in the Pacific? Eisenhower requested a few hours to think. Marshall gave him a legal pad and pointed to an empty office. What happened next would alter the course of Eisenhower's life and, ultimately, the course of the war. Eisenhower returned to Marshall's office and delivered his assessment. The Philippines could not be saved. General MacArthur was surrounded and would likely be captured or killed. America's Pacific Fleet had been crippled at Pearl Harbor. But Australia must be held at all costs, because losing it would give Japan control of the entire Pacific. America needed to establish a line of defence running from Australia through the island chains, build up forces, and then begin the long campaign of island hopping toward Japan. It was a cold, realistic assessment that essentially wrote off thousands of American and Filipino troops in the Philippines, including Eisenhower's former boss MacArthur. Marshall stared at Eisenhower for a full minute without speaking. Then he said 5 words that changed everything. "I agree with you. Do it." From that moment, Eisenhower became indispensable. Marshall assigned him to the War Plans Division, where he worked 18-hour days coordinating strategy across multiple theaters. He slept on a cot in his office. His wife remained in San Antonio, Texas, seeing her husband perhaps 1 week every 3 months. Eisenhower lost 20 pounds in the first 2 months, but Marshall watched him carefully, testing him with increasingly complex problems. Could he handle pressure? Could he see the big picture while managing details? Could he work with difficult personalities? Could he make decisions without complete information? Every test Eisenhower passed. In February 1942, Marshall promoted him to Major General, skipping the rank of Brigadier General entirely. This was almost unheard of. Eisenhower had been a lieutenant colonel just 3 years earlier. Now he wore 2 stars. In June 1942, Marshall sent Eisenhower to London as Commanding General, European Theatre of Operations. He leapfrogged over 366 officers senior to him. Men who had commanded divisions in World War I now reported to an officer who had never commanded anything larger than a training camp. The reaction in the army was shock and, in many quarters, outrage. Who was this staff officer from Kansas? What battles had he won? What troops had he led? The British were equally sceptical. When Eisenhower arrived in London, British officers assessed him with barely concealed doubt. He had a pleasant smile and a firm handshake, they reported, but could he actually fight? The answer to that question would take 2 years and countless casualties to determine. For now, in the summer of 1942, the most important military decision of the war had been made. An untested general who had never heard a shot fired in anger would command the Allied invasion of Europe. The story of how that decision proved either brilliant or catastrophic begins not with Eisenhower's triumphs, but with his failures. Because before he could become the general who launched D-Day, he first had to learn what it meant to send men to their deaths. That education would begin in the deserts of North Africa, where American forces would face the German Wehrmacht for the first time, and where Eisenhower would discover that being Supreme Commander meant living with ghosts that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The uncertain general was about to receive his first brutal lesson in the reality of command. December 14th, 1941, 8 o'clock in the morning. The War Department, Washington, D.C., Brigadier General Dwight Eisenhower walked into General George Marshall's office expecting a briefing. Instead, Marshall handed him a legal pad and asked a question that would determine the course of the Pacific War. "What should be our general line of action?" Marshall said nothing else. He simply left the room. Eisenhower stared at the yellow pad. America had been at war for exactly 1 week. The Pacific Fleet was crippled. The Philippines were under siege. Singapore was about to fall. The British Empire was reeling. And Marshall wanted an answer from a general who had arrived in Washington 5 days ago. Eisenhower understood immediately what was happening. This was not a briefing. This was a test. Marshall was famous for his method of evaluating officers. He gave them impossible problems with inadequate information and short deadlines, then watched how they thought under pressure. Did they panic? Did they make excuses? Did they try to please him or tell him the truth? Eisenhower had 2 hours. He went to an empty office, closed the door, and began to write. He had spent 4 years in the Philippines under MacArthur. He knew the terrain, the logistics, the impossibility of defending the islands without naval support. What he wrote next would essentially condemn thousands of American soldiers, including men he knew personally, to death or capture. But it was the strategic truth. At 10 o'clock, Eisenhower returned to Marshall's office. His assessment was brutally clear. The Philippines could not be saved. Every ship, every aircraft, every soldier sent to reinforce MacArthur would be lost. The Japanese controlled the sea and air around the islands. Relief was impossible. But losing the Philippines did not mean losing the Pacific. Australia must be held at all costs. If Australia fell, Japan would control everything from India to Hawaii. America needed to establish a defensive line running from Australia through New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, build up forces, and then begin the counteroffensive. It meant abandoning MacArthur and 75,000 American and Filipino troops. It meant accepting a humiliating defeat, but it was the only strategy that could win the war. Marshall read the assessment without expression. The silence stretched for a full minute. Eisenhower wondered if he had just ended his career before it had begun. Then Marshall looked up and spoke 5 words. "I agree with you. Do it." In that moment, Eisenhower's life changed. Marshall assigned him to the War Plans Division and made him responsible for coordinating Pacific strategy. Within days, Eisenhower was working 18 to 20 hours every day, sleeping on a cot in his office, eating sandwiches at his desk. His wife Mamie remained in San Antonio. He saw her perhaps once every 2 months. Eisenhower lost 20 pounds in 8 weeks. His staff watched him age visibly, his hair greying, his face developing deep lines. But he never complained. Marshall had given him a test, and he had passed. Now came the real work. The War Plans Division in early 1942 was chaos. America was fighting a 2-front war with a military that had ranked 17th in the world just 2 years earlier. The army had barely 300,000 men in December 1941. Now it was trying to mobilize millions. Factories were being converted to war production. Bases were being built. Soldiers were being trained. Ships were being constructed. And someone had to coordinate all of it while simultaneously fighting battles in the Philippines, North Africa, and the Atlantic. That someone was increasingly Eisenhower. Marshall gave him problem after problem. How do we get supplies to Russia? Where do we invade North Africa? How do we build up forces in Britain for an eventual invasion of France? Every problem was urgent. Every solution was incomplete. Every decision affected millions of lives. What impressed Marshall was not that Eisenhower always had the right answer. It was how he thought about problems. Most generals focused on their own service branch. Infantry officers thought about ground combat. Naval officers thought about ships. Air Force officers thought about bombing campaigns. Eisenhower thought about how all 3 services could work together to achieve strategic objectives. When Marshall asked about North Africa, Eisenhower's response included naval convoy routes, air cover requirements, supply lines, political complications with Vichy France, and the need to coordinate with British forces. He saw warfare as a system, not a collection of separate battles. This was exactly what Marshall needed for coalition warfare against Germany and Japan. In March 1942, Marshall sent Eisenhower to London to assess the build-up of American forces. Eisenhower spent 2 weeks meeting with British commanders, inspecting bases, and evaluating readiness for a cross-channel invasion. What he found was sobering. The British had been fighting for 3 years and were exhausted. They had been bombed, blockaded, and beaten in Norway, France, Greece, and North Africa. They were deeply skeptical that American forces, which had never fought the Germans, could succeed where they had failed. Eisenhower returned to Washington and reported the truth. Britain could not invade France in 1942. The forces were not ready. The landing craft did not exist. The logistics were impossible. But they had to do something or risk losing public support and allowing Germany to transfer all forces to fight Russia. The solution was Operation Torch, an invasion of French North Africa in November 1942. Marshall made another decision that shocked the army. He promoted Eisenhower to Major General in February, skipping Brigadier General entirely. Then in June, he sent Eisenhower back to London as Commanding General, European Theatre of Operations. Eisenhower was now a 3-star Lieutenant General. He had gone from Lieutenant Colonel to Lieutenant General in 18 months, the fastest promotion in American military history. He leapfrogged 366 officers senior to him. The reaction was predictable. Who was this staff officer? What battles had he won? What gave him the right to command generals who had led troops in combat? Marshall's answer was simple. Eisenhower understood what this war required: coalition warfare, joint operations, strategic thinking, and political sophistication. Those skills were rarer than battlefield courage. The British were equally sceptical when Eisenhower arrived in London. They assessed him as pleasant, intelligent, and diplomatic. But could he fight? The British Army had been fighting Germany since 1939. They had learned through bitter experience what worked and what did not. Now, this untested American general was going to command the invasion of North Africa, which would be the first major American ground combat against Germany. The British gave him professional courtesy, but privately doubted he was up to the task. Field Marshal Alan Brooke, chief of the Imperial General Staff, wrote in his diary that Eisenhower was a good coordinator but no real commander. That assessment would haunt Eisenhower for years. Marshall understood what the British did not yet see. Modern warfare was as much political as military. Eisenhower would command British, American, and eventually French forces. He would have to coordinate with Churchill, Roosevelt, de Gaulle, and Stalin. He would have to balance competing national interests while keeping the alliance together. He would have to make decisions that pleased no one but served the common objective. Battlefield experience was valuable, but what Marshall needed was someone who could think strategically, act diplomatically, and command loyally, without letting ego interfere. Eisenhower had demonstrated all three qualities in 72 hours of crisis management after Pearl Harbor. Now he would have to prove himself in combat. That test would begin in November 1942 on the beaches of North Africa, and the results would nearly end his career before it truly began. November 8th, 1942, 05:30 hours. The Mediterranean coast of North Africa. Operation Torch. 107,000 Allied troops hit 3 landing zones simultaneously: Morocco, Oran, and Algiers. This was Eisenhower's first combat command. He was 52 years old. He had trained for this moment his entire career, and within hours, everything started going wrong. The landings at Morocco faced unexpected resistance from Vichy French forces. Naval gunfire killed American soldiers who had expected a friendly reception. At Oran, French warships engaged the Allied fleet. At Algiers, a planned coup by French resistance fighters failed. Eisenhower sat in his headquarters deep inside the Rock of Gibraltar, receiving fragmentary reports by telegraph, unable to communicate directly with his commanders on the beaches. He had spent months planning this operation. Now he could only wait and hope. The political situation was even worse than the military one. France had surrendered to Germany in 1940, but the Vichy government controlled French colonies in North Africa. These forces were technically neutral, but equipped with French tanks, aircraft, and coastal guns. Eisenhower had hoped they would not fight. Instead, they fought hard. American soldiers who expected to be greeted as liberators instead faced machine gun fire from men who should have been allies. The confusion was total. Then, on November 10th, Admiral François Darlan, the commander of all Vichy forces and a known Nazi collaborator, was discovered in Algiers, visiting his sick son. Eisenhower's deputy, General Mark Clark, negotiated a deal. If Darlan ordered French forces to stop fighting, the Allies would recognize him as the leader of French North Africa. It was a devil's bargain that would haunt Eisenhower for months. The Darlan deal, as it became known, was militarily brilliant and politically catastrophic. French resistance ceased. Allied forces secured North Africa with minimal casualties. Supply lines were established. The build-up toward Tunisia could begin. But the political cost was severe. Darlan was a fascist who had collaborated with Hitler, signed anti-Jewish laws, and ordered French forces to fight the British. Now he was America's ally, installed by American power. The outcry was immediate. American newspapers denounced the deal. British politicians demanded explanations. Roosevelt publicly distanced himself from the decision while privately supporting it. Churchill defended it in Parliament but faced fierce criticism. Eisenhower, who had approved the deal to save Allied lives, found himself attacked from all sides. He learned his first bitter lesson: military success did not guarantee political support. While the political storm raged, Eisenhower faced the reality of combat command. American forces pushed east into Tunisia, where they encountered German troops for the first time. The results were shocking. German tanks were superior, German tactics were better. German soldiers had been fighting for 3 years and knew their business. American forces, despite months of training, were simply not ready. Units became disorganized, communications broke down, commanders made basic mistakes. In January 1943, Eisenhower wrote in his diary, "The trouble is that we are green. Everything is new to us, and we are learning in the toughest school there is. The education was about to become much more expensive. February 14th, 1943, Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. German forces under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel launched a massive counterattack against American positions. The Afrika Korps, veteran troops who had been fighting in the desert since 1941, hit the American II Corps with coordinated tank and infantry assault. American units disintegrated. Men abandoned equipment and ran. Officers lost control of their troops. Within 3 days, German forces had advanced 50 miles and inflicted 6,500 casualties. 300 Americans were killed, 3,000 were wounded, 3,000 were missing or captured. The American army had been routed in its first major engagement with German forces. News of the disaster reached Eisenhower at his headquarters in Algeria. He was devastated. Eisenhower flew to Tunisia to inspect the battlefield. What he saw shocked him. Burned-out American tanks littered the valley. Abandoned weapons, vehicles, and supplies were scattered across the landscape. Body collection teams were still recovering corpses. Eisenhower walked through the wreckage in silence. This was not theoretical strategy. This was not planning in an office. This was the result of his decisions. These men had died because of orders that ultimately came from him. He wrote in his diary that night, "I am very much disappointed with the showing we made in this battle. There is no excuse for it. But disappointment was not enough." He had to fix what was broken, and that meant making decisions no staff officer ever had to make. He had to fire generals. Major General Lloyd Fredendall had commanded II Corps during the Kasserine disaster. He was senior to Eisenhower, a friend, and politically well connected in Washington, but he had failed. His headquarters was located too far from the front. He had not visited his forward units. His orders had been unclear and contradictory. His troops had lost confidence in him. Eisenhower knew that keeping Fredendall in command would mean more disasters and more deaths. On March 6, 1943, Eisenhower relieved him and replaced him with Major General George S. Patton, Jr. It was the first time Eisenhower had fired a general. The decision was agonizing. Fredendall's career was over. But Eisenhower learned that being Supreme Commander meant making brutal choices. Nice guys did not win wars. Patton transformed II Corps in a matter of weeks. He imposed strict discipline, wearing helmets and ties at all times, fining soldiers $50 for uniform violations. He moved his headquarters forward. He visited troops daily. He fired incompetent officers without hesitation. He trained units relentlessly. And when he led them back into battle against the same German forces that had defeated them at Kasserine, American troops fought with ferocity and skill. They pushed German forces back, inflicted heavy casualties, and proved they could match the Wehrmacht in combat. Eisenhower watched the transformation with relief. His decision to fire Fredendall and appoint Patton had been correct, but the lesson was clear. Command meant living with the consequences of every decision, including the ones that destroyed careers and ended friendships. By May 1943, Allied forces had secured North Africa. 275,000 German and Italian troops surrendered, a staggering defeat for the Axis. But the victory had been expensive. American forces had suffered 18,000 casualties. Eisenhower had learned what it meant to receive casualty reports, to write letters to families, to visit hospitals filled with wounded soldiers who looked at him with trust and pain. He had learned to fire generals, to make political compromises that sickened him, and to live with decisions that haunted his sleep. The British assessment of Eisenhower began to shift. He was no longer the untested staff officer. He was a general who had been bloodied in combat and had learned from his mistakes. The education of Dwight Eisenhower was far from complete. North Africa had been a testing ground, a place where mistakes could be corrected without losing the war. The next operation, the invasion of Sicily, would be more complex. And beyond Sicily lay the ultimate test, the invasion of France itself. Eisenhower had learned to be ruthless. He had learned to balance military necessity with political reality. He had learned to live with ghosts, but the hardest lessons were still ahead, because command was not just about making difficult decisions. It was about making the right difficult decisions when the entire outcome of the war depended on getting it right. That test would come on a stormy night in June 1944, when Eisenhower would have to decide whether to launch the largest invasion in human history or postpone it and possibly lose the war. First, however, he had to prove he could manage the one thing more dangerous than the German army, his own coalition of allies. May 13th, 1943. Allied headquarters, Algiers. The North African campaign was over. 275,000 Axis troops had surrendered. Victory parades were planned. Newspapers proclaimed American military genius. But inside Eisenhower's headquarters, a different reality was taking shape. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commander of the British 8th Army, was holding court with journalists, describing how his forces had pursued Rommel across the desert and secured Tunisia. American contributions were mentioned as supporting actions. British correspondents filed stories emphasizing Commonwealth heroism while treating American forces as junior partners. Eisenhower read these reports with growing frustration. American troops had fought and died for this victory, but Montgomery was claiming credit. This was Eisenhower's introduction to coalition politics. Montgomery was a brilliant battlefield commander, meticulous in planning, cautious in execution, and absolutely convinced of his own genius. He was also the most popular general in Britain, a hero who had defeated Rommel at El Alamein and saved the British Empire from collapse. Churchill adored him. The British public worshipped him. And he had no intention of taking orders from an American general he considered his inferior. Eisenhower faced an impossible situation. If he publicly contradicted Montgomery, he would create a rift in the alliance. If he said nothing, American commanders would lose faith in him. He chose a middle path that would define his command style for the rest of the war. He allowed Montgomery his glory, while quietly ensuring American interests were protected. The test came immediately with planning for Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily. Montgomery proposed that British forces land on the eastern coast and drive north to Messina, while American forces protected the British flank by landing on the southern and western coasts. In other words, the British would have the glory of capturing the main objectives, while Americans played a supporting role. Eisenhower's American commanders, particularly George Patton, were outraged. But Eisenhower approved the plan. He understood something his more aggressive subordinates did not. Keeping the coalition together was more important than national pride. If the British felt marginalised, they could undermine the entire war effort. Churchill controlled 60% of Allied forces. Britain could not be treated as a junior partner. July 10th, 1943. The invasion of Sicily began with the largest airborne operation attempted to date. American and British paratroopers dropped behind enemy lines to secure key bridges and roads. The operation was a disaster. High winds scattered transport aircraft. Paratroopers landed miles from their objectives. Many drowned when they landed in the Mediterranean. Naval gunners, not informed of the airborne operation, shot down transport planes returning from the drop. The chaos was total. But ground forces still managed to secure beachheads, and the invasion pushed forward. What followed was not a battle, but a race. Patton and Montgomery competed to see who could reach Messina first. The strategic objective, trapping German forces on the island, was forgotten in favour of personal glory. Eisenhower watched this competition with alarm. Patton drove his forces at breakneck speed, using tanks and trucks to advance along coastal roads. Montgomery moved more carefully, concerned about casualties and logistics. The British press portrayed Montgomery as brilliant and cautious, while describing Patton as reckless. The American press did the opposite. Eisenhower found himself managing egos rather than managing the battle. He wrote to his chief of staff, General Walter Bedell Smith, that commanding the Allied forces was like trying to arrange the blankets to keep three prima donnas happy at the same time. The blankets were never quite long enough. Someone was always left uncovered and complaining. August 17th, 1943. Patton reached Messina first, beating Montgomery by hours. American newspapers proclaimed a great victory. Patton had proved American forces could outfight and outmaneuver the British. But the strategic reality was grim. While Patton and Montgomery raced each other, German forces executed a brilliant evacuation across the Strait of Messina to mainland Italy. 100,000 German troops, along with tanks, artillery, and vehicles, escaped to fight another day. Sicily had been secured, but the German army remained intact. Eisenhower was furious, but said nothing publicly. Criticizing his commanders would damage morale and play into German propaganda. He filed his anger away, adding it to the growing list of coalition compromises he had to make. The Italian campaign that followed Sicily revealed the full cost of coalition politics. Churchill wanted to invade Italy and knock Mussolini out of the war. American planners wanted to focus all resources on the cross-channel invasion of France. Eisenhower was caught in the middle. The compromise was Operation Avalanche, a landing at Salerno in September 1943. The battle was nearly a disaster. German forces counterattacked so fiercely that Allied forces almost were driven back into the sea. Eisenhower considered the possibility of catastrophic defeat. In the end, naval gunfire and reinforcements saved the beachhead. But the Italian campaign turned into a grinding war of attrition, advancing mile by bloody mile up the mountainous Italian peninsula. Churchill's promised soft underbelly of Europe turned out to be what one American general called one damn mountain after another. Throughout this period, Eisenhower's British deputy, Field Marshal Harold Alexander, was quietly undermining American command authority. Alexander reported directly to Churchill and the British Chiefs of Staff, bypassing Eisenhower. He made decisions without consulting Eisenhower and countermanded orders Eisenhower had issued. The British command structure assumed that British generals would lead, while Americans provided troops and supplies. Eisenhower finally confronted Alexander in a private meeting, making clear that he, not Alexander, commanded Allied forces in the Mediterranean. Alexander apologized but continued to maneuver behind Eisenhower's back. The message was clear. The British did not truly accept American command, no matter what the organizational charts said. December 7th, 1943, Tunis, Tunisia. President Franklin Roosevelt's aircraft landed at the conclusion of the Tehran Conference. Eisenhower met Roosevelt for dinner, expecting to discuss Italian operations. Instead, Roosevelt told him, "Well, Ike, you are going to command Overlord." Overlord was the code name for the invasion of France, the largest military operation in history. For months, there had been speculation about who would command it. Churchill wanted Alexander. The British Chiefs of Staff wanted a British commander. Roosevelt had promised the position to General George Marshall, but Roosevelt had decided he needed Marshall in Washington. The compromise was Eisenhower. He was acceptable to the British, loyal to Marshall, and had proven he could manage coalition warfare. Eisenhower's education was complete. Now came the examination. The promotion to Supreme Commander, Allied Expeditionary Force, came with a bitter realization. Eisenhower would command more than 3 million men from 12 nations. He would coordinate the largest invasion in history. He would have to balance competing political interests from Washington, London, Paris, and Moscow. And he would have to do all of this while managing commanders who believed they should have his job. Montgomery would command all ground forces on D-Day, which meant Eisenhower would be watching from England while his deputy ran the battle. Churchill would second-guess every decision. De Gaulle would demand recognition for France. Stalin would accuse the Allies of delaying to let Russia bleed. And through it all, Eisenhower would have to keep the alliance together, because without that alliance, Germany would win. Eisenhower established one absolute rule for his command. Any officer who expressed national prejudice would be sent home immediately, regardless of rank. British officers who complained about Americans, or American officers who complained about British, were relieved of duty. Eisenhower insisted on using the phrase Allied forces rather than British and American forces. He ordered combined staffs where British and American officers worked side by side. He personally attended social functions with both nations' officers, making clear that coalition unity was not optional. Some officers thought he was too concerned with politics, but Eisenhower understood what they did. Not. Battles are won by soldiers, but wars are won by alliances. Keeping that alliance together, despite Montgomery's ego, Churchill's interference, and American impatience, would prove to be as difficult as defeating Hitler, and far more delicate. August 3rd, 1943, 95th Evacuation Hospital, Sicily. The sun was brutal, turning the hospital tent into an oven. Wounded soldiers lay on cots, waiting for treatment or evacuation. Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr., commander of the 7th Army, walked through the ward visiting men who had been wounded in his drive toward Messina. Patton stopped to talk with each soldier, asking about his wounds, thanking him for his service. Then he came to Private Charles Cool. Cool was sitting on a cot, fully dressed, with no visible wounds. When Patton asked what was wrong, Cool replied, "I guess I can't take it." Patton exploded. He called Cool a coward, slapped him across the face with his glove, and ordered him sent back to the front. Medical staff stood frozen in shock. 1 week later, Patton did it again. At the 93rd Evacuation Hospital, he encountered Private Paul Bennett, another soldier with no visible wounds. Bennett had been at the front for 4 years, first fighting in North Africa, then in Sicily. He was shaking uncontrollably. When Patton asked what was wrong, Bennett said, "It's my nerves." Patton went into a rage. He slapped Bennett, pulled out his ivory-handled pistol, waved it in the soldier's face, and threatened to shoot him. He called him a yellow bastard and ordered him court-martialed. Medical personnel were horrified. These men were suffering from what doctors called combat exhaustion, what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. They were sick, not cowardly. But Patton believed that cowardice was contagious and had to be stamped out before it infected other troops. News of the incidents reached Eisenhower within days. Medical staff had filed official reports. Eisenhower read them with growing horror. Patton was his most aggressive commander, the general who had transformed ICARMS after Kasserine, the man who had just captured Sicily in a lightning campaign. But he had committed an unforgivable act. He had abused 6 soldiers and threatened to murder one of them. Eisenhower faced the most difficult decision of his career to that point. If he relieved Patton, he would lose his best battlefield commander. If he protected Patton, he would undermine military justice and medical treatment of combat stress. Eisenhower spent 3 days considering his options. Then he made a decision that would define his command philosophy. Eisenhower wrote Patton a 3-page letter that was both devastating and carefully calibrated. He acknowledged Patton's brilliance as a combat commander, but condemned his behaviour as inexcusable. "I am well aware of the necessity for hardness and toughness on the battlefield," Eisenhower wrote, "but this does not excuse brutality, abuse of the sick, nor exhibition of uncontrollable temper in front of subordinates." Eisenhower ordered Patton to apologise personally to both soldiers, to apologise to the medical staff, and to apologise to every division in the 7th Army. It was a humiliation designed to punish Patton while keeping him in uniform. Eisenhower gambled that Patton would accept the punishment rather than resign. Patton did. He made the rounds of his divisions, standing before thousands of soldiers, and apologised for his actions. Eisenhower thought the matter was closed. He had kept the incident secret to avoid damaging Patton's reputation and undermining morale. But secrets do not stay secret in war. In November 1943, columnist Drew Pearson broke the story on national radio. "General Patton slapped a soldier who was suffering from shell shock," Pearson reported. "The reaction was immediate and furious. Congress demanded Patton's court-martial. Newspapers called for his removal. Eisenhower received more than 1,600 letters demanding Patton be fired." Secretary of War Henry Stimson was besieged with complaints. The political pressure was enormous. Eisenhower's decision to protect Patton suddenly looked like a cover-up. He had to make the same decision again, but this time in public. Eisenhower chose loyalty over politics. He sent a cable to General Marshall in Washington defending Patton as indispensable to the war effort. He acknowledged that Patton's behaviour was wrong, but argued that his battlefield skills outweighed his personal flaws. "Patton is the only available Army commander for his present assignment who has actual experience fighting Germans and extensive experience in the type of tank warfare that will be required in France," Eisenhower wrote. He pointed out that German intelligence specifically mentioned Patton as the Allied commander they feared most. Removing Patton would be a gift to Hitler. Marshall supported Eisenhower's decision, and Roosevelt, though angry, did not overrule it. Patton stayed in uniform. But the cost was high. The price of protecting Patton was that Eisenhower could not give him a combat command for the invasion of France. Patton was too controversial. If American soldiers were killed under his command, Congress would blame Eisenhower for keeping him. The solution was brilliant and cruel. Patton would be assigned to command the 1st United States Army Group, a massive force supposedly assembling in southeast England for an invasion of Calais. Allied intelligence would make sure German spies knew Patton was there. The Germans, believing Patton would lead the invasion, would keep forces concentrated at Calais. In reality, the 1st Army Group did not exist. It was an elaborate deception involving fake radio traffic, inflatable tanks, and dummy aircraft. Patton, the most aggressive general in the American army, would spend D-Day commanding a phantom army. Patton accepted his role in the deception with barely concealed fury. He knew he was being sidelined. He knew other generals would earn glory on D-Day while he supervised fake equipment. But he also knew that Eisenhower had saved his career when he could have ended it. The relationship between the two men became complicated. Patton admired Eisenhower's strategic thinking but resented his caution. Eisenhower valued Patton's battlefield genius but was exhausted by his ego and misconduct. They were bound together by necessity. Eisenhower needed Patton to win battles. Patton needed Eisenhower to protect him from the consequences of his own behaviour. It was not friendship. It was a partnership of convenience that would last until the end of the war. Years later, Eisenhower would reflect on the Patton problem in his memoirs. He wrote that Patton was the most difficult subordinate I ever had, and the most valuable. The slapping incidents taught Eisenhower an essential lesson about command. Sometimes the right decision is not the one that feels good. Firing Patton would have been emotionally satisfying and politically safe. Keeping him was morally ambiguous and politically dangerous. But Eisenhower had learned to separate his personal feelings from strategic necessity. He did not like what Patton had done. He did not even particularly like Patton as a person, but he needed him to win the war. That calculation, cold and pragmatic, was what separated a staff officer from a commander. Staff officers could afford moral purity. Commanders had to make compromises that would haunt them forever. The decision to protect Patton would have consequences that echoed through the rest of the war. Patton would go on to command the Third Army in the breakout from Normandy, race across France, relieve Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge, and become a legendary figure in American military history. Without Eisenhower's protection, in August 1943, none of that would have happened. But Eisenhower would also have to manage Patton's ego, his insubordination, and his reckless statements for the next 2 years. The general he could not fire would remain a constant source of anxiety, brilliance, and frustration. Eisenhower had learned to live with difficult decisions. Now he would learn to live with the consequences of those decisions, knowing that every choice he made sent ripples forward in time, affecting battles not yet fought and soldiers not yet born. January 21st, 1944, Street Paul's School, London. A Victorian building that once educated British aristocrats now housed the headquarters for Operation Overlord, the invasion of Hitler's Europe. General Dwight Eisenhower sat at a conference table studying maps of the Normandy coast. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery stood at the front of the room with a pointer, describing his assessment of the invasion plan. Montgomery spoke with absolute confidence, as he always did. But his words sent a chill through the room. "This plan is completely inadequate," he announced. 3 divisions cannot possibly succeed. We need 5 divisions on the beaches, plus 3 airborne divisions dropped inland. Anything less is suicide. The room fell silent. The original plan had taken 18 months to develop. Montgomery was proposing to throw it out and start over. Eisenhower faced an impossible choice. The original Cossack plan, developed by British Lieutenant General Frederick Morgan, called for 3 divisions landing on 3 beaches between Caen and Cherbourg. It was based on the number of landing craft available and the logistical capacity to support the invasion. Montgomery was demanding nearly double that force, 5 divisions landing on 5 beaches, requiring thousands more landing craft, ships, and support vessels. The problem was simple. Those landing craft did not exist. Building them would take months. Every week of delay gave Germany more time to strengthen the Atlantic Wall. But Montgomery was right. 3 divisions were too few. If the invasion was concentrated on too narrow a front, German reserves could counterattack and drive the Allies back into the sea. Eisenhower made his decision. "We go with 5 divisions," he said. "Find the landing craft." The consequences of that decision rippled through the entire Allied war effort. The invasion, originally scheduled for May 1st, 1944, had to be postponed to early June to allow time to build and assemble landing craft. Operations in the Mediterranean had to be scaled back, with landing craft recalled from Italy to England. The British construction industry went into overdrive, converting factories to produce the specialised vessels needed for an amphibious assault. American shipyards did the same. By spring of 1944, more than 50,000 vessels of all types were assembling in British ports. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, transport ships, and the critical landing craft that would actually carry troops to the beaches. The logistics were staggering. Never in human history had so much military power been concentrated in one place for one purpose. But landing craft were only one of Eisenhower's problems. The second battle was with his own Air Force commanders. Air Chief Marshal Arthur Tedder, Eisenhower's deputy, and Air Chief Marshal Trafford Lee Mallory, commanding Allied air forces, wanted to continue the strategic bombing campaign against German cities and industrial targets. Eisenhower demanded they shift focus to support the invasion. Specifically, he wanted them to bomb French and Belgian railway networks to prevent German reserves from reaching the beaches. The air commanders were appalled. Bombing rail yards meant bombing French cities. French civilians would die, perhaps tens of thousands of them. Churchill was equally horrified, warning that killing French civilians would turn France against the Allies. But Eisenhower was adamant. The argument raged for weeks. Eisenhower threatened to resign if the air forces were not placed under his direct command. Churchill took the matter to Roosevelt, hoping the president would overrule Eisenhower. Roosevelt refused. The transportation plan, as Eisenhower's bombing campaign was called, went forward. From April through June 1944, Allied bombers struck 79 railway centres across France and Belgium. Locomotives were destroyed, bridges were bombed, marshalling yards were rendered useless, and French civilians died, somewhere between 12,000 and 15,000 of them. Eisenhower accepted this burden, knowing that every dead French civilian reduced German mobility and saved Allied lives on D-Day. It was the kind of brutal calculation that kept him awake at night, smoking cigarettes in his quarters, thinking about the price of command. The third battle was over the airborne drops. The plan called for 3 divisions of paratroopers, the American 82nd and 101st Airborne, plus the British 6th Airborne, to drop behind the beaches hours before the invasion. Their mission was to secure bridges, block roads, and prevent German reinforcements from reaching the coast. But Leigh Mallory, the air commander, predicted catastrophe. Based on the Sicily experience, where paratroopers had been scattered and suffered heavy casualties, Leigh Mallory estimated 70% losses for the airborne forces. 70%. Eisenhower sat in his office and did the mathematics. 3 divisions meant approximately 25,000 men. 70% casualties meant 17,500 killed, wounded, or captured in a single night. The number was almost incomprehensible. Eisenhower met with Leigh Mallory privately to discuss the assessment. The air marshal was convinced the operation would fail. The transport aircraft were too slow and vulnerable. German anti-aircraft defences were too strong. The drop zones were too small. The result would be massacre. Eisenhower listened to every argument, then asked a simple question. If we do not drop the airborne forces, what happens to the men landing on the beaches? Without the airborne drops, German reserves would reach the beaches faster, more men would die on Utah and Omaha, the entire invasion could fail. Leigh Mallory had no answer. Eisenhower made his decision. The operation goes forward as planned, he said. I will have to live with this the rest of my life. He was not being dramatic. He genuinely believed he was sending 17,000 men to their deaths. That burden was his alone. May 15th, 1944. Street Paul's school again. The final pre-invasion briefing. Every senior commander attended. Montgomery, Bradley, Patton, Ramsey, Tedder, Leigh Mallory. Prime Minister Winston Churchill attended, along with King George VI, the South African Prime Minister Jan Smuts, and the British Chiefs of Staff. The walls were covered with maps showing every beach, every unit assignment, every naval approach. Eisenhower opened the briefing with a simple statement. We are here to discuss the operation that will determine the outcome of this war. Then he turned the floor over to his commanders. For 5 hours, they walked through the plan in excruciating detail. Ships, troops, supplies, timing, contingencies, everything that could be known was known. Everything that could be planned was planned. Churchill spoke at the end of the briefing. His words were not encouraging. He warned that the beaches could be choked with the bodies of American and British youth. He reminded everyone present that amphibious invasions were notoriously difficult and often failed. He expressed his fears that Overlord could turn into another Gallipoli, the disastrous British invasion of Turkey in World War I that had killed tens of thousands and accomplished nothing. Eisenhower listened without expression. Churchill's fears were well-founded. Everything about Overlord was a gamble. The Germans had built the Atlantic Wall, for 4 years, pouring concrete and laying mines along every foot of coastline. They had stationed 50 divisions in France, including elite panzer units that could counterattack within hours. The weather in the English Channel was notoriously unpredictable. Storms could scatter the invasion fleet, high waves could swamp landing craft, strong winds could scatter paratroopers miles from their targets. But the alternative to gambling was losing. If the Allies did not invade France in 1944, Russia might make a separate peace with Germany. If Russia made peace, Germany could concentrate all forces against the Western Allies. Britain would face invasion. America would have to fight Germany alone. The window for victory was closing. Stalin was demanding action. Churchill wanted to delay. Eisenhower had to balance these competing pressures while managing his own doubts. He had spent 18 months preparing for this moment. He had assembled the largest military force in history. He had coordinated air, naval, and ground operations across multiple nations. And in a few weeks, he would have to make the final decision, go or no go. That decision would be his alone, and it would determine whether he was remembered as the man who saved civilization or the man who drowned it in the English Channel. May turned to June, the forces assembled. 156,000 men prepared to board ships. 5,000 ships and 11,000 aircraft stood ready. Millions of tons of supplies were staged in warehouses and depots across southern England. The entire operation was so massive that German intelligence could not miss it. The question was where the invasion would land. Operation Fortitude, the elaborate deception plan, had convinced German high command that the main invasion would hit the Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel. George Patton's Phantom First Army Group, supposedly assembling in southeast England, reinforced this belief. German forces remained concentrated at Calais, waiting for an invasion that would never come. Eisenhower's deception was working perfectly, but it would only work if the weather cooperated. And as June approached, the weather refused to cooperate at all. June 4th, 1944, 04:15 hours, Southwick House, Portsmouth, England. Eisenhower's headquarters for Operation Overlord. Rain hammered against the windows. Wind howled through the trees. Group Captain James Stagg, the chief meteorologist for the invasion, stood before Eisenhower and his senior commanders, delivering the worst possible news. Conditions are unsuitable for the invasion. Stagg reported, cloud ceiling too low for bombers, seas too rough for landing craft, winds too strong for paratroopers. The invasion scheduled for June 5th was impossible. Eisenhower stared at the weather maps, showing storm systems rolling across the Atlantic. He had 175,000 men already embarked on ships. Many had been at sea for hours, heading toward France. Now he had to call them back. Eisenhower polled his commanders. Montgomery voted to postpone. Admiral Bertram Ramsay, commanding naval forces, reluctantly agreed. Tedder, the air commander, said conditions made air support impossible. Only Lee Mallory seemed relieved, privately hoping the entire operation would be cancelled. Eisenhower made the decision everyone expected. We postponed 24 hours, he said. The order went out by radio to hundreds of ships already at sea. Some convoys had sailed from ports as far away as Scotland. They had to reverse course, return to port, and wait. The men packed into landing craft, already seasick from hours of rough seas, now faced another day of waiting. Morale plummeted. Security was compromised. Every additional hour increased the risk that German intelligence would discover the invasion fleet. But there was no choice. Launching in a storm guaranteed failure. Eisenhower returned to his quarters, but did not sleep. He smoked cigarettes and thought about the narrow window for invasion. The operation required specific conditions: a full moon for the airborne drops, low tide at dawn to expose German beach obstacles, and acceptable weather. These conditions occurred only a few days each month. If June 5th was scrubbed, the next window was June 6th. If June 6th was scrubbed, the next window was June 19th. But by June 19th, the moon phase would be wrong. The next suitable window would not occur until July, and by July the Germans might have reinforced Normandy so heavily that invasion became impossible. Eisenhower faced the possibility that his 18 months of planning, his assembly of the largest military force in history, might be defeated not by the German army but by the English Channel weather. At 21:30 hours on June 4th, Eisenhower returned to the conference room for another weather briefing. Stagg had new information. The storm currently battering southern England would pass. Behind it, a brief window of marginally acceptable weather would open on June 6th. Not good weather, not ideal weather. Marginally acceptable? Winds would decrease from force 6 to force 3 or 4. Cloud ceiling would lift to perhaps 3,000 feet, enough for bombers to operate. Seas would remain rough but possibly manageable for landing craft. The window would last perhaps 36 hours before another storm system arrived. It was not the weather Eisenhower wanted. It was barely the weather he needed. But it might be the only weather he would get. Eisenhower polled his commanders again. Montgomery spoke first. "I would say, go," he announced with his usual confidence. Ramsey, the admiral, hesitated, then nodded his agreement. The Navy could manage in these conditions, though it would be difficult. Tedder, the air commander, was less optimistic. "It's chancy," he said. "Air support would be limited. Many bombers might not reach their targets. But it could be done." Leigh-Mallory remained silent, his opposition clear from his expression, but his political sense warning him not to be the only commander voting against the invasion. Eisenhower sat at the table, feeling the weight of 3 million men on his shoulders. He did not speak immediately. The silence stretched. Everyone in the room knew this was the decision that would define Eisenhower's life and possibly determine the outcome of the war. June 5th, 1944, 04:15 hours. Another weather conference, the final one before the point of no return. Stagg confirmed his earlier forecast. The window was holding. Weather on June 6th would be marginal but acceptable. After that, another storm. Eisenhower looked at each of his commanders. No one spoke. The decision was his alone. He was supreme commander. He had authority to launch the invasion or cancel it. No vote, no consensus could remove that burden from him. He thought about the men on the ships, already seasick and exhausted. He thought about the French civilians waiting for liberation. He thought about the Russians, bleeding and dying on the Eastern Front, demanding that the Western Allies finally invade. He thought about Churchill's warning of beaches choked with corpses. And he thought about the consequences of not going. "Okay," Eisenhower said quietly. "Let's go." The words were soft, almost casual. But they set in motion the largest military operation in human history. The order flashed out to hundreds of ships. Proceed to France. Paratroopers began boarding aircraft. Naval guns, loaded ammunition. Soldiers checked their weapons one final time. The machinery of Overlord, dormant for 24 hours, roared back to life. Eisenhower left the conference and went to his quarters. He should have felt relief. The decision was made. Events were now beyond his control. Instead, he felt a crushing sense of dread. In 18 hours, men would begin dying because of his decision. If the invasion failed, the blame would be entirely his. History would remember him as the general who destroyed the Allied cause. That evening, Eisenhower visited the 101st Airborne Division at their airfield. Paratroopers were preparing to board C-47 transport aircraft for the jump into Normandy. They had blackened their faces with burnt cork. They carried weapons, ammunition, grenades, rations, and medical supplies. Each man was so heavily loaded he could barely walk. They would be the first to land in France, dropping hours before dawn into territory held by German forces. Many would be killed before they touched ground. Others would land miles from their objectives and spend the night wandering, lost in the darkness. Leigh-Mallory's prediction of 70% casualties haunted Eisenhower's thoughts. The paratroopers recognized Eisenhower and gathered around him. He tried to project confidence, smiling and joking with the men. "See you in France," he told them. But a photographer captured Eisenhower's expression as he watched the paratroopers board their aircraft. His face showed profound sadness. These were teenagers, farm boys, and factory workers who had volunteered to jump out of aircraft into enemy territory at night. They trusted him. They believed the invasion would succeed because their commanders had told them it would. Eisenhower knew the statistical probability. Many of the young men he was watching would be dead before sunrise. He was sending them to die because the strategic necessity of invading France outweighed the individual cost. Command meant living with that knowledge. After the last aircraft took off, Eisenhower returned to his trailer. He sat at his desk and wrote a statement to be released if the invasion failed. "Our landings in the Cherbourg Havre area have failed to gain a satisfactory foothold, and I have withdrawn the troops," he wrote. "My decision to attack at this time and place was based upon the best information available. The troops, the air, and the Navy did all that bravery and devotion to duty could do. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone. He dated the statement July 5th, revealing his mental state. He meant to write June 5th. The mistake showed how exhausted he was, how much psychological weight he carried. He folded the statement and put it in his wallet, where it would remain, never sent, a reminder of the loneliest night of his life. Eisenhower did not sleep. He remained in his trailer, smoking cigarettes, waiting for reports from Normandy. The first paratroopers would land around 01:30 hours on June 6th. The first landing craft would hit the beaches at 06:30. For 5 hours, he would have no information about whether his decision had been right or catastrophically wrong. He thought about the weather forecast. Stagg had said marginally acceptable. What if Stagg was wrong? What if the storm had not passed? What if landing craft were swamped in rough seas? What if bombers could not see their targets through clouds? What if the entire invasion collapsed into chaos because he had trusted a meteorologist's educated guess? These questions circled endlessly in his mind. There was no escape from them. He had made the decision. Now he could only wait. Years later, historians would debate whether Eisenhower made the right choice. Some argued he should have waited for better weather in late June or July. Others pointed out that German defences grew stronger every day and that delay might have made invasion impossible. Eisenhower himself never expressed doubt about the decision, at least not publicly. But privately, he carried the weight of it for the rest of his life. Every June 6th, he would return to Normandy for memorial ceremonies. Every year, he would stand on those beaches and remember the men who died because he said, "Let's go," on a stormy morning in June 1944. The loneliest decision had been made. Now came the longest night, waiting to discover whether he had saved Western civilization or drowned it in the English Channel. June 6th, 1944, 06:30 hours. The coast of Normandy, France. 5 beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, Sword. 156,000 Allied soldiers crossing the English Channel in the largest amphibious invasion in history. The sky was grey with low clouds. The sea was rough, waves 4 to 6 feet high. Landing craft pitched and rolled. Men vomited from seasickness. They had been on the water for hours, cold, wet, and terrified. Then the beaches came into view through the morning haze. Soldiers could see the cliffs rising above the sand. They could see the German bunkers and pillboxes built into the hillsides. They could see the obstacles in the water: steel hedgehogs, wooden stakes, mines attached to posts. And then the ramps dropped and men charged into water that was sometimes waist deep, sometimes over their heads, carrying 70 pounds of equipment while German machine guns opened fire. At Southwick House in England, Eisenhower waited. The first reports came in by radio from naval observers offshore. Utah Beach, the westernmost landing, was going well. The 4th Infantry Division had landed slightly off course but encountered light resistance. They were pushing inland, casualties were minimal. Gold and Juno beaches, where British and Canadian forces were landing, reported similar success. Resistance was heavier than at Utah, but manageable. Sword Beach, the easternmost landing, faced strong German defences, but British forces were establishing a foothold. 4 of the 5 beaches were succeeding. Then came the reports from Omaha Beach. The words were stark and terrifying. Troops pinned down, unable to advance, casualties heavy, situation critical. Omaha Beach was a killing ground. The 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions had landed directly in front of the German 352nd Infantry Division, one of the strongest units defending Normandy. German machine gun positions on the bluffs had interlocking fields of fire covering every inch of beach. Artillery was pre-registered on the landing zones. Mines were everywhere. The pre-invasion naval bombardment had been ineffective due to low clouds and rough seas. The bombers had dropped their payloads too far inland, missing the German positions entirely. When the landing craft ramps dropped, men walked into a nightmare. Machine gun fire cut through entire units before they reached the beach. Bodies floated in the surf. Wounded men drowned in the rising tide. Officers were killed within minutes of landing. Units lost cohesion. Soldiers huddled behind beach obstacles, unable to advance, unable to retreat. General Omar Bradley, commanding American ground forces, stood on the USS Augusta offshore and read the reports with growing horror. By mid-morning, he was considering evacuating Omaha Beach entirely. The situation appeared hopeless. 2,000 soldiers were pinned down on a beach less than half a mile long. German fire was so intense that follow-up waves could not land. Engineers trying to clear obstacles were killed before they could work. Tanks that were supposed to provide fire support had sunk in the rough seas, their flotation devices failing. Bradley sent an urgent message to Eisenhower. Omaha Beach was failing. The entire invasion might collapse. Eisenhower, receiving this report at his headquarters, felt the full weight of command. If Omaha failed, the invasion force would be split. German reserves could counterattack the separated beaches individually. The Allies might be driven back into the sea. His worst fears were coming true. But Bradley's reports were hours out of date. On Omaha Beach, something was changing. Small groups of soldiers, leaderless after their officers were killed, began to move. A sergeant from the 29th Division rallied men behind him and charged up a draw between German positions. A lieutenant from the 1st Division led engineers to blow gaps in the barbed wire. A colonel, finding his men paralysed by fire, stood up and shouted, "Two kinds of people are staying on this beach. The dead and those who are going to die. Now let's get the hell out of here." Men followed him, not because of grand strategy or careful planning, but because staying on the beach meant certain death. They improvised using terrain features the planners had not identified. They supported each other, strangers from different units working together. By early afternoon, they had broken through the German defences and secured the bluffs. Omaha Beach had been saved not by generals, but by sergeants and corporals whose names Eisenhower would never know. While the Americans struggled at Omaha, the British and Canadians were facing their own challenges. Montgomery's objective was to capture the city of Caen on D-Day itself. Caen was the key to the entire Normandy campaign, a transportation hub that controlled access to the interior of France. But German resistance was stronger than expected. The 21st Panzer Division, one of the few armoured units in the area, counterattacked in the afternoon. British forces stopped the panzers but could not push forward to Caen. By nightfall on June 6th, Montgomery's forces were still miles short of their objectives. Caen, which was supposed to fall on D-Day, would not be captured for another 6 weeks. This failure would have profound consequences for the entire Normandy campaign. At midnight on June 6th, Eisenhower finally had complete reports from all 5 beaches. The invasion had succeeded. Allied forces had established a foothold in France, but the cost had been high, and the results were mixed. Total Allied casualties for D-Day were approximately 10,000, including 4,414 confirmed dead. Omaha Beach alone accounted for more than 2,000 casualties, including 300 dead. The airborne drops had been chaotic. 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were scattered across 25 miles of Norman countryside. Many paratroopers had drowned in flooded fields. Others had been killed before they could cut free of their parachutes. Entire units were lost or surrounded. Lee Mallory's prediction of 70% casualties had been wrong, but casualties were still heavy. Approximately 2,500 airborne troops were killed, wounded, or captured on D-Day. Yet the invasion had succeeded in the most important respect. Allied forces were ashore, and staying ashore. The Atlantic Wall, which Hitler had claimed was impregnable, had been breached. German High Command had been caught completely off guard. Hitler was asleep when the invasion began, and his staff refused to wake him. The critical German panzer reserves, which could have counterattacked and potentially driven the Allies back into the sea, were not released until late afternoon on June 6th. By then, Allied forces had established defensive positions and brought artillery ashore. The moment for German victory had passed. The Allies had won the race for the beaches. What came next would be a grinding campaign to break out of Normandy, but the essential fact remained: D-Day had succeeded. Eisenhower's gamble on the weather had paid off. If he had waited for the next tide window on June 19th, he would have launched into a massive storm that would have scattered the fleet and made invasion impossible. The June 6th window was the only one that would work. Stagg's forecast had been exactly right. The marginal weather had been just barely good enough. But Eisenhower also understood how close D-Day had come to failure. Omaha Beach had been within an hour of complete disaster. If German forces had been more alert, if their reserves had been released earlier, if the weather had been slightly worse, the invasion could have failed. Eisenhower had made the right decision, but the margin between success and catastrophe had been terrifyingly thin. In the weeks after D-Day, Eisenhower visited the beaches. He walked on Omaha, seeing the German bunkers still scarred by bullet impacts, the beach obstacles still visible at low tide. He saw the temporary cemeteries where American dead were buried in long rows. Thousands of white crosses stretched across fields near the beaches. Each cross represented a man who had died because Eisenhower said, "Let's go," on June 5th. He did not speak about his emotions publicly. He posed for photographs with troops, inspected captured German positions, and met with commanders. But those who knew him well said he aged visibly in the days after D-Day. The weight of command was no longer theoretical. It was measured in white crosses on Normandy fields. The invasion had succeeded, but the war was far from over, and the hardest decisions were still ahead. June 12, 1944, 6 days after D-Day, Normandy, France. Allied forces had secured the 5 landing beaches and pushed inland, establishing a lodgement area approximately 25 miles wide and 10 miles deep. 156,000 men had landed on D-Day. By June 12th, that number had grown to 326,000. Supplies poured ashore at artificial harbours called mulberries. The invasion had succeeded, but Eisenhower, reviewing daily reports at his headquarters in England, saw a troubling pattern emerging. Montgomery's British forces had still not captured Caen. American forces were bogged down in terrain called the bocage, a nightmare landscape of small fields bordered by thick hedgerows that made every advance a separate battle. The Germans were reinforcing faster than Allied intelligence had predicted. What was supposed to be a rapid breakout was turning into a grinding war of attrition. The bocage country of Normandy was unlike anything American troops had trained for. Each field was surrounded by hedgerows 8 to 10 feet high, dense masses of earth, roots, and vegetation that tanks could not cross. German defenders placed machine guns and anti-tank weapons in the hedgerows, creating deadly ambushes. American tanks trying to climb over hedgerows exposed their thin belly armour to German fire. Infantry attacking across open fields were cut down. Progress was measured in hundreds of yards per day, sometimes less. Units suffered World War I level casualties for minimal gains. Medical facilities were overwhelmed. Replacement soldiers arrived at the front and died within days, sometimes within hours. The rapid mobile warfare Eisenhower had planned was impossible in this terrain. The war had become a slugging match. Montgomery's failure to capture Caen was even more troubling. The city was the hub of the road network in Normandy. Controlling Caen meant controlling access to the flat tank country beyond, where Allied armour could exploit its superiority. But German forces held Caen with fanatical determination. Montgomery launched Operation Epsom on June 26th, an attempt to encircle the city. The attack gained 7 miles at the cost of 5,500 casualties and failed to capture Caen. Montgomery claimed this was according to plan, that his attacks were drawing German armour away from the American sector. But Eisenhower's intelligence staff saw something different. They saw a British army that was afraid to take casualties, that preferred cautious advances and limited objectives over aggressive attacks. Montgomery was fighting not to lose rather than fighting to win. July 18th, 1944. Operation Goodwood. Montgomery's attempt to break through east of Caen. 1,100 British tanks assembled for the largest armoured assault since D-Day. The plan was to carpet bomb German positions with heavy bombers, then send the armour through the gap. Eisenhower approved the operation because Montgomery promised it would be decisive. The reality was anything but. The bombing was effective, but German defences recovered faster than expected. British tanks advanced 7 miles, exactly as they had in Operation Epsom, before running into layered German defences. By the end of the day, 400 British tanks had been destroyed or damaged. 5,500 British casualties. Caen was still not fully captured. Montgomery again claimed this was the intended result, that he was writing down German armour. Eisenhower was furious, but said nothing publicly. The political pressure on Eisenhower was intense. Churchill was losing patience with Montgomery. The British Prime Minister had visited Normandy and been appalled by the lack of progress. Churchill wrote to Eisenhower demanding more aggressive action. But Eisenhower could not simply fire Montgomery. He was the most popular general in Britain, a national hero. Relieving him would cause a political crisis that could fracture the alliance. Eisenhower was trapped between military necessity and political reality. He needed Montgomery to attack more aggressively, but he could not force him to do so without destroying the coalition he had worked so hard to build. It was the central paradox of his command. He was supreme commander, but he could not always command. The American solution came not from planning, but from desperation. July 25th, 1944. Operation Cobra. General Omar Bradley's attempt to break through German lines south of St. Lo. The plan was similar to Montgomery's approach. Carpet bomb a narrow section of German defences, then push armour through. 1800B, 17 flying fortresses dropped 4,000 tons of bombs on a 6 square mile area. The bombing was devastating but also tragically inaccurate. American bombs fell short, killing 111 American soldiers, including Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the highest-ranking American officer killed in the European theatre. Eisenhower faced another agonizing decision. Should he continue the attack after such a catastrophic friendly fire incident, or should he call it off and accept that the breakout was impossible? Eisenhower ordered the attack to continue. McNair's death was a tragedy, but stopping would waste the sacrifice and leave American forces still trapped in the hedgerows. Bradley's forces pushed through the bombed area and encountered German defences that had been shattered by the bombardment. Resistance was lighter than expected. By July 28th, American forces had advanced 25 miles, the deepest penetration since D-Day. The bocage had been broken, and waiting to exploit this breakthrough was George Patton. On August 1st, 1944, Patton's Third Army was activated. His mission was to race through the gap Cobra had created and break out into open country. Patton, sidelined since D-Day by the slapping incidents, finally had his combat command. What followed was the kind of mobile warfare he had dreamed about. Patton's Third Army advanced 400 miles in 30 days. They captured town after town, overran German supply depots, liberated cities, and spread chaos through German rear areas. Patton drove his forces relentlessly, moving so fast that German commanders could not establish defensive lines. By early September, Third Army had reached the Moselle River near the German border. The breakout that had taken 6 weeks to achieve in the bocage had turned into a pursuit that covered most of France in a month. American newspapers proclaimed Patton a genius. The public, which had been frustrated by the slow progress after D-Day, now celebrated the rapid advance. Eisenhower watched Patton's success with relief and concern. Relief, because the breakout had finally happened. Concern, because Patton was outrunning his supply lines and creating coordination problems with British forces advancing to the north. The success of the breakout created a new crisis. German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army were trapped in a pocket near the town of Falaise. If Allied forces could close the pocket, they could capture or destroy the entire German force in Normandy. 250,000 German troops, along with tanks, artillery, and vehicles, were caught between advancing American forces from the south and British and Canadian forces from the north. The gap between these forces was only 15 miles wide and narrowing. Eisenhower saw the opportunity immediately. If the Germans escaped, they would regroup and defend the German border. If they were trapped, the war in France would essentially be over. The key was speed. Montgomery's forces had to advance from the north, Patton's forces had to hold from the south, and Bradley's forces had to close the gap. It should have been simple. It was not. Montgomery moved cautiously. He was concerned about friendly fire incidents if British and American forces converged too quickly. He wanted clear boundaries and careful coordination. By the time British and Canadian forces closed the northern edge of the pocket, a gap remained open to the east. German forces poured through this gap in a desperate retreat. Somewhere between 40,000 and 100,000 German troops escaped the Falaise pocket. They abandoned their heavy equipment, left their wounded behind, and fled toward Germany. Allied air forces slaughtered the retreating columns, creating scenes of such carnage that even hardened soldiers were sickened. The roads were choked with burned vehicles and dead horses. But the German soldiers themselves escaped to fight another day. These forces would later reinforce the German defence of the Siegfried Line and participate in the Battle of the Bulge. Eisenhower was privately furious. The Falaise pocket should have been closed. The war could have been shortened by months. But he said nothing publicly. Criticising Montgomery would reignite the command controversy. Blaming Bradley would undermine American confidence. Instead, Eisenhower took the long view. Allied forces had liberated France. German forces in the West were shattered, even if not completely destroyed. Paris would be liberated on August 25th. The pursuit would continue into Belgium and Holland. The end of the war seemed near, possibly by Christmas 1944. But Eisenhower's silence about the Falaise Gap was another compromise, another moment where military judgment yielded to political necessity. The escaped Germans would return to haunt him. The compromises that held the alliance together were also extending the war, and the cost of those compromises would be measured in the battles yet to come. September 1st, 1944. Chartres, France. After 3 months of combat in Normandy, Allied forces were racing across France faster than anyone had imagined possible. Paris had been liberated 6 days earlier. Brussels would fall in 3 days. The German army in the west appeared to be collapsing. American and British newspapers proclaimed that the war would be over by Christmas. But inside a tent, at an airfield near Chartres, Eisenhower was about to make a decision that would determine how the war would end, and that decision would make him the most criticised general in the Allied command. He was meeting with Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery to discuss strategy for the final push into Germany. Montgomery arrived with a proposal he was certain would end the war within weeks. Eisenhower was about to reject it. Montgomery's plan was audacious and simple. Concentrate all Allied resources, 40 divisions, into a single thrust under his command. Drive north through Belgium and Holland, cross the Rhine at Arnhem, then race across the North German plain to Berlin. Eisenhower listened as Montgomery laid out his vision, using maps and boundless confidence. "Give me the supplies and the authority," Montgomery said, "and I will deliver you Berlin and end this war." It was the kind of bold stroke that military historians love. One massive punch, all Allied power concentrated at a single point, smashing through German defences before they could recover. Montgomery estimated he could reach Berlin in 6 weeks. Patton, commanding Third Army to the south, had a similar proposal. Give him all the supplies and he would drive through Frankfurt to Berlin, reaching the German capital even faster than Montgomery. Both generals promised victory. Both demanded total priority. Eisenhower rejected both plans. The decision that Eisenhower made that day would be debated by historians for decades. Instead of a single thrust, he ordered a broad front advance. All Allied armies would push forward simultaneously, keeping pressure on German forces across the entire front. Montgomery would advance through Belgium into Holland. Bradley's forces would drive toward the Siegfried Line and the Saar. Patton would push toward the Rhine. No single commander would receive priority over others. No single axis of advance would receive all available supplies. Resources would be distributed based on operational necessity rather than concentrated for a knockout blow. Montgomery was furious. Patton was apoplectic. Both generals believed Eisenhower was throwing away the chance to end the war quickly. Military historians would later argue the same. But Eisenhower understood something his more aggressive subordinates did not. The broad front strategy was not primarily a military decision. It was a political one. If Eisenhower gave Montgomery priority, American commanders would revolt. If he gave Patton priority, the British would feel marginalised. The alliance that had held together through 3 years of war would fracture at the moment of victory. American public opinion would not accept a British general leading the final assault on Germany while American forces played a supporting role. British public opinion would not accept the opposite. Eisenhower was supreme commander of a coalition, not a national army. His job was not simply to defeat Germany, but to defeat Germany while keeping the alliance intact. That required balancing national interests, managing egos, and accepting that the politically necessary strategy might not be the militarily optimal one. But Eisenhower's decision was also based on logistics, a subject that neither Montgomery nor Patton wanted to discuss. Allied supply lines stretched more than 400 miles from Normandy beaches to the front lines in Belgium and eastern France. Every gallon of fuel, every artillery shell, every ration had to be trucked along these supply lines. The Red Bull Express, a convoy system of 6,000 trucks, driven primarily by black soldiers, operated 24 hours a day hauling supplies forward. But the trucks themselves consumed enormous amounts of fuel. The railway system in France had been destroyed by Allied bombing before D-Day, exactly as Eisenhower had ordered. Repairing those railways would take months. The port of Cherbourg had been captured, but its facilities were demolished by retreating Germans. The port of Antwerp had been captured intact, but the approaches were still held by German forces, making it unusable. The mathematics of logistics were brutal. Allied forces required approximately 20,000 tons of supplies per day. The Red Bull Express and other convoy systems could deliver only 7,000 tons per day. there was a 13,000-ton daily shortfall. Units were rationing ammunition, tanks were running out of fuel. The spectacular pursuit across France was grinding to a halt, not because of German resistance, but because Allied forces literally could not keep moving. Montgomery's single thrust would require concentrating supplies for 40 divisions, approximately 12,000 tons per day, leaving nothing for other fronts. If that thrust failed, if it was stopped or counterattacked, there would be no reserves, no alternative plan, no way to recover. Eisenhower was not willing to bet everything on one roll of the dice, especially when the dice were being rolled by Montgomery, whose record of cautious advances and inflated claims filled him with doubt. Patton's proposal had the same logistical problems, but with added complications. Third Army was already at the end of the longest supply line. Giving Patton priority would mean stopping all other armies, including Montgomery's, to feed his advance. The political cost would be catastrophic. Churchill would appeal directly to Roosevelt. British commanders would threaten resignation. The alliance would face its worst crisis at the moment when unity was most essential. And Patton himself was a risk. He was brilliant but also reckless, prone to driving his forces beyond their logistical capacity, leaving them vulnerable to counterattack. Eisenhower trusted Patton's tactical skill but not his strategic judgment. Patton saw every problem as something that could be solved by attacking faster. Logistics, politics, and coalition management did not interest him. They interested Eisenhower very much. September 10th, 1944. Eisenhower met with Montgomery at Brussels Airport. The meeting took place in Eisenhower's aircraft because Eisenhower had injured his knee and could barely walk. Montgomery, standing over the seated Eisenhower, delivered what amounted to an ultimatum. The broad front strategy was wrong. It would prolong the war. It would cost unnecessary casualties. Only a single thrust to Berlin, under British command, made military sense. Eisenhower listened, his face showing no emotion. Then he explained his decision. "Steady, Monty," he said. "You can't speak to me like I'm your boss." Montgomery, shocked that the diplomatic Eisenhower would assert authority so bluntly, backed down. But the tension remained. Montgomery believed Eisenhower was making a catastrophic mistake. Eisenhower believed Montgomery's ego was blinding him to strategic reality. The broad front strategy had another advantage that neither Montgomery nor Patton appreciated. It kept German forces guessing about where the main Allied attack would come. If the Allies concentrated on a single axis, German forces could concentrate their defences at that point. The broad front forced Germany to defend everywhere, spreading their limited resources thin. German commanders could not mass reserves because they did not know where to mass them. Each Allied probe had to be treated as a potential breakthrough. This uncertainty multiplied the effectiveness of Allied attacks. It was, in essence, the inverse of the Blitzkrieg strategy that Germany had used so effectively earlier in the war. Instead of one massive hammer blow, it was constant pressure across the entire front, wearing down German defences through exhaustion rather than destruction. But Eisenhower's strategy also had a cost. The broad front advance meant that Allied forces would reach the Rhine on a wide front rather than penetrating deeply at a single point. This gave Germany time to recover, to organise new defensive lines, to conscript additional troops, and to fortify the Siegfried Line. The spectacular pursuit of August turned into the grinding advance of September and October. By November, Allied forces were bogged down again, fighting in conditions that resembled World War I. Casualties mounted. The war that was supposed to be over by Christmas 1944 would continue into 1945. Critics would argue that Eisenhower's caution extended the war by months, costing tens of thousands of lives. Eisenhower would argue that his strategy prevented the alliance from fracturing and ensured that victory, when it came, would be shared by all allies rather than claimed by one nation. The debate over broad front versus narrow thrust would continue long after the war ended. Military historians analysing the campaign with perfect hindsight would argue both sides. Some would say Montgomery's plan could have worked, that a concentrated thrust in September 1944 would have crossed the Rhine before German defences solidified, possibly ending the war before the Battle of the Bulge. Others would argue that such a thrust would have outrun its supplies, exposed its flanks to counterattack, and resulted in disaster. Eisenhower himself never expressed doubt about his decision. He believed that keeping the coalition together was more important than any single military operation. The broad front strategy was not the most aggressive option. It was not the option that would have looked best in history books, but it was the option that balanced military necessity with political reality. And in coalition warfare, that balance was everything. Eisenhower's chief of staff, General Walter Bedell Smith, once said that Eisenhower's greatest skill was not tactical brilliance or strategic vision, but the ability to make practical decisions when perfect solutions did not exist. The broad front strategy exemplified this skill. It was not perfect. It was not elegant. It did not promise spectacular results. But it worked. It kept American, British, Canadian, and French forces advancing together. It prevented the alliance from fracturing. It distributed the burden and glory of victory among all participants. And it ensured that when Germany finally surrendered, the victory would belong to the coalition, not to any individual general or nation. That was Eisenhower's gift, the ability to see past the military problem to the political solution. It made him frustrating to serve under, especially for aggressive commanders like Patton and Montgomery. But it made him exactly the commander the Allied coalition needed. September 10th, 1944. The same day, Eisenhower rejected Montgomery's plan for a single thrust to Berlin. He approved something else, Operation Market Garden. It would be the largest airborne operation in history, dropping 35,000 paratroopers into Holland to seize a series of bridges leading to the Rhine. If it succeeded, Allied forces would cross the Rhine months ahead of schedule and drive into the heart of Germany. If it failed, it would be one of the costliest Allied defeats of the war. Eisenhower approved Market Garden despite his reservations because he needed to give Montgomery something after rejecting his broader strategic plan. It was another compromise, another political decision dressed in military planning. And it would prove that compromises made to preserve coalition unity could be as deadly as enemy bullets. The plan was Montgomery's brainchild, conceived in the aftermath of his failed argument for a concentrated thrust to Berlin. If he could not have 40 divisions for a drive across the North German plain, he would settle for a rapid strike into Holland. The objective was the bridge at Arnhem, a city 60 miles behind German lines. Between Allied positions in Arnhem lay 9 bridges crossing rivers and canals. Capture all 9 bridges, and Allied armour could race to Arnhem, cross the Rhine, and threaten the industrial Ruhr region of Germany. The elegance of the plan appealed to Montgomery. It was bold, creative, and promised dramatic results. It was also based on assumptions that would prove catastrophically wrong. Market Garden had 2 components. Market was the airborne operation. American 82nd Airborne would seize bridges at Nijmegen. American 101st Airborne would capture bridges at Eindhoven and Veghel. And British 1st Airborne would take the bridge at Arnhem. Garden was the ground operation. British XX Corps would advance north along a single road, linking up with each airborne division in sequence, then crossing the Rhine at Arnhem. The plan required perfect execution. The airborne drops had to succeed. The bridges had to be captured intact. The ground advance had to maintain its timetable. German resistance had to be light. Any failure at any point would doom the entire operation. Eisenhower's chief of staff, Bedell Smith, reviewed the plan and predicted disaster. Eisenhower approved it anyway. September 17th, 1944, early afternoon. The operation began with the largest daylight airborne assault in history. 1,100 transport aircraft and 1,200 gliders carried paratroopers to their drop zones. The sky filled with aircraft for as far as observers could see. Dutch civilians looked up in amazement as thousands of paratroopers descended on their occupied country. The American drops at Eindhoven and Nijmegen went relatively well. Units landed close to their objectives, bridges were captured, though fighting was heavier than expected. But at Arnhem, everything went wrong from the first moment. British 1st Airborne Division landed 8 miles from the bridge, far from their objective. The radios they carried did not work. And German forces in the area were much stronger than Allied intelligence had predicted. Dutch resistance fighters had provided intelligence that should have stopped Market Garden before it started. They reported that 2 SS Panzer divisions, the 9th and 10th, were refitting near Arnhem. These were elite units with tanks, heavy weapons, and experienced troops. Allied intelligence officers dismissed these reports as exaggerated. Surely Germany would not position armoured divisions directly in the path of an obvious airborne landing zone. The intelligence officers were wrong. The Dutch resistance was right. British paratroopers dropping near Arnhem landed almost on top of German armoured forces. The result was predictable. German forces reacted with speed and violence. British paratroopers trying to reach the bridge at Arnhem were ambushed, surrounded, and destroyed. Only a small force under Lieutenant Colonel John Frost reached the bridge and held the northern end for 4 days against overwhelming odds. The ground advance, Operation Garden, encountered its own problems. British XXX Corps had to advance along a single elevated road through flat countryside. The road, quickly nicknamed Hell's Highway, was easily defended. German forces positioned anti-tank guns covering every approach. British tanks, confined to the road, could not maneuver. Each German strongpoint had to be reduced in a frontal assault. Progress was measured in hours per mile. The timetable, which called for XXX Corps to reach Arnhem in 2 days, collapsed immediately. American airborne forces holding bridges at Eindhoven and Nijmegen fought desperately to keep the road open while waiting for British armour that advanced at a crawl. The elegant plan that looked so good on maps dissolved into a grinding battle of attrition. September 20th, 1944. Frost's battalion at Arnhem Bridge was out of ammunition and overwhelmed. German forces systematically destroyed the buildings where British paratroopers had taken defensive positions. The paratroopers fought with captured German weapons, then with grenades, then hand to hand. When Frost was wounded and his position overrun, the survivors surrendered. The bridge at Arnhem, the entire objective of Market Garden, would remain in German hands. British 1st Airborne Division, trapped north of the Rhine with no relief in sight, fought a desperate defensive battle. They were surrounded, outnumbered, running out of supplies, and cut off from reinforcement. XXX Corps was still miles away, still trying to fight up Hell's Highway, still moving too slowly to save them. September 25th, 1944. The order came to evacuate whatever remained of British 1st Airborne from north of the Rhine. Under cover of darkness, small boats ferried survivors across the river. Of the 10,000 British and Polish airborne troops deployed to Arnhem, only 2,400 escaped. 1,485 were killed. 6,854 were captured, most of them wounded. British 1st Airborne Division effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. The operation that Montgomery had promised would end the war had instead destroyed an elite division and achieved nothing. Market Garden was over. It had failed. And Eisenhower had to take responsibility for approving it. The strategic consequences were severe. The Allies would not cross the Rhine for another 6 months. The port of Antwerp, captured intact in early September, could not be opened because German forces in Holland controlled the approaches. Opening Antwerp would require a separate campaign, the Battle of the Scheldt, which would last until November and cost thousands of additional casualties. The spectacular pursuit of August had turned into the grinding stalemate of autumn. Winter was approaching. German forces, given time to recover by Market Garden's failure, were rebuilding defensive lines. The war that should have been over by Christmas now looked like it would extend into 1945. And 17,000 Allied casualties had been suffered for an operation that gained nothing. Eisenhower handled the failure with characteristic diplomacy. He did not publicly blame Montgomery, though privately he was furious. He did not criticize the intelligence failures, though they had been catastrophic. He did not point out that his own chief of staff had predicted disaster. Instead, he absorbed the criticism himself, telling reporters that Market Garden had been worth attempting and that the lessons learned would be valuable in future operations. This was classic Eisenhower, taking responsibility for failure to protect the coalition. But the cost of that protection was high. Montgomery faced no consequences for proposing an operation that destroyed an elite division. Intelligence officers who dismissed Dutch resistance reports faced no disciplinary action. The alliance was preserved, but military accountability was sacrificed. The lesson of Market Garden was painful and clear. Operations driven by political necessity rather than military logic were likely to fail. Eisenhower had approved Market Garden not because he believed it would succeed, but because he needed to give Montgomery something after rejecting his broader strategic plan. It was a sop, a consolation prize, dressed up as a bold stroke. And it had cost 17,000 casualties and 6 weeks of operational momentum. The decision haunted Eisenhower for the rest of his life. In his memoirs, he defended Market Garden as a calculated risk worth taking. But those who knew him said he privately regretted approving it, knowing that his desire to placate Montgomery had sent thousands of men into a doomed operation. Command meant making hard choices. Sometimes it meant making choices you knew were wrong to preserve something more important. Market Garden was Eisenhower's most expensive compromise. November 15th, 1944. Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, Versailles, France. Eisenhower sat at his desk reading medical reports that should have alarmed every commander in the European theatre, but somehow did not. Trench foot casualties in American forces. 10,000 cases in October alone. 46,000 cases expected between November and February. Trench foot, a condition caused by prolonged exposure to cold and wet, was crippling more soldiers than German bullets. Men were losing toes, feet, entire legs to gangrene. Divisions were losing combat effectiveness not because of enemy action but because soldiers could not keep their feet dry. This was World War I all over again, and it was happening because Allied logistics could not deliver waterproof boots and dry socks to the front lines fast enough. The war was supposed to be over. Instead, it was turning into a winter nightmare. The euphoria of August and September was gone. Allied forces were stuck. Montgomery's British and Canadian armies were fighting through flooded Dutch countryside, slowly clearing German forces from the Scheldt estuary to open the port of Antwerp. American forces were battering themselves against the Siegfried Line, the German defensive fortifications along the border. Every pillbox had to be taken in close assault. Every bunker had to be destroyed with explosives. Casualties mounted daily for gains measured in hundreds of yards. The weather turned miserable. Rain fell constantly. Fog grounded aircraft for days at a time. Roads turned to mud. Supply convoys bogged down. And the soldiers, wearing summer uniforms because winter clothing had not arrived, suffered from exposure. Morale plummeted. The Hürtgen forest southeast of Aachen became a symbol of everything wrong with the autumn campaign. It was 50 square miles of dense forest filled with German pillboxes, minefields, and artillery positions. American commanders decided to attack through it rather than bypass it, fearing that German forces in the forest could threaten the flank of any advance toward the Rhine. The result was a meat grinder. Units disappeared into the forest and emerged, if they emerged at all, as hollow shells. The 4th Infantry Division entered the Hürtgen with 14,000 men and left with 4,000 effectives. The 28th Infantry Division suffered similar casualties. Tree bursts from German artillery, shells exploding in the forest canopy and showering shrapnel downward, caused horrific wounds. Bodies lay unrecovered in the undergrowth. By December, American forces had suffered 33,000 casualties in the Hürtgen forest and advanced approximately 50 square miles. It was worse than anything seen in World War I. Eisenhower was also fighting a different kind of battle within his own command structure. Montgomery, still bitter about the broad front strategy, was openly criticising Eisenhower to British politicians and journalists. He claimed that Allied operations lacked coordination, that there was no clear strategy, that Eisenhower was trying to command from Versailles rather than from a forward headquarters. The criticism was carefully worded to sound like professional military assessment rather than personal attack, but the effect was the same, undermining confidence in Eisenhower's leadership. Churchill, frustrated by the lack of progress, was listening to Montgomery's complaints. Eisenhower received diplomatic messages from London, questioning his strategic decisions. The alliance was fraying again. December 1st, 1944, Eisenhower drafted a letter to Montgomery that was never sent but revealed his state of mind. In it, he threatened to recommend that the combined chiefs of staff choose between him and Montgomery, knowing full well that such a confrontation would destroy the alliance he had worked so hard to build. The letter was brutal and personal, accusing Montgomery of insubordination and lack of cooperation. Eisenhower showed the draft to his chief of staff, Bedell Smith, who advised him not to send it, "You'll win the fight but lose the war," Smith said, meaning the political war of coalition management. Eisenhower filed the letter away. Another swallowed grievance. Another moment of private fury suppressed for the sake of Allied unity. But the fact that he drafted it showed how close the alliance was to fracturing. On December 7th, 1944, Eisenhower travelled to Maastricht in Holland for a face-to-face meeting with Montgomery. The meeting was tense from the first moment. Montgomery arrived with prepared notes outlining his complaints about Allied strategy. He lectured Eisenhower on the principles of command, suggesting that Eisenhower did not understand basic military doctrine. He demanded that a single ground commander be appointed and not coincidentally suggested himself for the position. Eisenhower, normally diplomatic, nearly lost his temper. He told Montgomery that the current command structure would remain in place and that if Montgomery could not accept that, then other arrangements could be made. It was the closest Eisenhower came to firing Montgomery during the entire war. Montgomery, realising he had pushed too far, backed down, but the damage to their relationship was severe and permanent. While Eisenhower struggled with Montgomery's ego, German forces were preparing something that Allied intelligence completely missed. Along the German border, in the Ardennes region of Belgium, a massive force was assembling in complete secrecy. 25 divisions, 250,000 troops, 1,000 tanks, 1,200 artillery pieces, the largest German offensive since 1940. Hitler personally planned the operation, codenamed Watch on the Rhine. The objective was to split Allied forces, capture the port of Antwerp, and destroy 4 Allied armies. German commanders thought the plan was insane. They argued that Germany lacked the fuel, ammunition, and reserves to sustain such an offensive. Hitler overruled them. If Germany did not attack, he argued, the war was lost anyway. One desperate gamble was better than slow defeat. The attack would come through the Ardennes, the same route Germany had used to invade France in 1940. Allied intelligence saw what it expected to see: a defensive German army husbanding resources. Radio traffic in the Ardennes was minimal, suggesting weak forces. Aerial reconnaissance was limited by bad weather. The few reports of German build-ups were dismissed as local reinforcements. Eisenhower's intelligence chief, British Major General Kenneth Strong, assessed that Germany was incapable of mounting a major offensive. The Ardennes was a quiet sector, held by 4 American divisions, spread over 80 miles of front. These divisions were either green units gaining experience or exhausted units resting after heavy combat. They were not prepared for a major attack. No one expected a major attack. The assumption was that Germany was finished, that the Wehrmacht was a spent force waiting for the inevitable Allied advance into Germany. The assumption was catastrophically wrong. Eisenhower spent December 15th at his headquarters in Versailles. His mood was bleak. The war was dragging on with no end in sight. Montgomery was insubordinate. Bradley was exhausted. Patton was agitating for more supplies to mount an offensive in the Saar. The port of Antwerp had finally opened after 3 months of fighting, but supply shortages continued. Ammunition was rationed. Reinforcements were not arriving fast enough to replace casualties. Eisenhower's health was suffering from the stress. He smoked 4 packs of cigarettes a day. His blood pressure was dangerously high. He slept poorly, often waking at 3 in the morning to work. That evening, his promotion to 5-star General of the Army became official. A lavish dinner was held in his honour at Versailles. Champagne flowed. Speeches were given. Eisenhower smiled and accepted congratulations. 24 hours later, the German army would attack in the Ardennes, and Eisenhower would face the greatest crisis of his command. December 16th, 1944, 05:30 hours. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. German artillery opened fire along an 80-mile front. Thousands of guns firing simultaneously, the largest German barrage since 1941. American soldiers, in forward positions, many of them sleeping, died before they understood what was happening. The ground shook, trees exploded, foxholes collapsed, communication lines were cut. Within minutes, German infantry emerged from the forest fog, elite Volksgrenadier divisions advancing in strength. Behind them came the tanks, SS Panzer divisions that were supposed to be destroyed or defending elsewhere. The Americans in the Ardennes, 4 divisions spread impossibly thin, were being attacked by 25 German divisions. The German offensive that Allied intelligence said was impossible had just begun. The American units in the path of the attack responded with confusion and courage. Some positions collapsed immediately. Defenders overwhelmed by force, they had no chance of resisting. Other positions held stubbornly. Small groups of soldiers fighting from foxholes and bunkers against vastly superior numbers. Communication with higher headquarters was sporadic or non-existent. Unit commanders made decisions based on incomplete information, not knowing if they were facing a local attack or a major offensive. By midday on December 16th, entire American regiments had been surrounded or destroyed. German forces had penetrated 10 miles into Allied lines at multiple points. The situation was chaotic and deteriorating rapidly, but news travelled slowly. Eisenhower, at his headquarters in Versailles, would not learn the full scope of the crisis until evening. When the reports finally reached Eisenhower, they were fragmentary and alarming. Heavy German attacks in the Ardennes, multiple penetrations, American forces withdrawing, casualties unknown. Eisenhower immediately understood what his intelligence staff had missed. This was not a local counterattack. This was a major offensive, perhaps Germany's final offensive. He called an emergency meeting of his senior commanders for December 19th at Verdun. For 3 days, as German forces drove deeper into Allied lines, Eisenhower coordinated the response from Versailles. He moved reserves toward the Ardennes before fully understanding the situation, trusting his instinct that any German attack of this scale had to be contained immediately. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, resting after Market Garden, were ordered to the Ardennes immediately. The 10th Armoured Division was diverted from Patton's 3rd Army. The 7th Armoured Division was pulled from 9th Army. Eisenhower was assembling forces before he knew exactly what he was defending against. December 19th, 1944, 11 o'clock. A drab military barracks in Verdun, France. Eisenhower's senior commanders gathered around a map showing the disaster unfolding in the Ardennes. German forces had created a 50-mile deep penetration into Allied lines, a massive bulge that gave the battle its name. American casualties were mounting. Entire divisions were cut off. The road junction at Bastogne was surrounded. German panzer forces were driving toward the Meuse River. If they crossed the Meuse, they could potentially reach Antwerp, splitting British and American forces and creating a catastrophe. Eisenhower's commanders expected him to panic, to order a general withdrawal, to pull forces back to more defensible positions. Instead, Eisenhower smiled. The present situation is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us and not of disaster, he said. There will be only cheerful faces at this conference table. Eisenhower saw what others did not yet see. Germany had committed its last reserves to this offensive. Every tank, every division, every gallon of fuel that Germany possessed was being thrown into the Ardennes. If the attack could be stopped, if the German forces could be destroyed in the Bulge, Germany would have nothing left to defend with. The war would be over. But stopping the attack required immediate, aggressive action. Eisenhower turned to Patton. "When can you attack north into the German flank?" he asked. Patton had anticipated the question. December 22nd, he replied, 3 days away. Other commanders thought Patton was being his usual overconfident self. Eisenhower knew better. "Don't be fatuous, George," he said. Patton pulled out a prepared plan. "This time, I'm not being fatuous," he said. Third Army would disengage from its current operations, pivot 90 degrees north, and attack into the southern flank of the German penetration. It would be the largest rapid redeployment of forces in American military history. The second critical decision came immediately after. Eisenhower decided to give Montgomery temporary command of all Allied forces north of the Bulge, including 2 American armies. This meant Bradley, commanding American ground forces, would lose direct control of more than half his troops. Bradley was humiliated and furious. American commanders threatened to resign rather than serve under Montgomery again. But Eisenhower's reasoning was sound. Communications between Bradley's headquarters in Luxembourg and the isolated American forces north of the Bulge were nearly impossible. Montgomery's headquarters in Belgium could coordinate the northern defence much more effectively. It was the right military decision. It was also politically explosive. Eisenhower knew he was risking American confidence in his leadership and feeding Montgomery's ego, but the alternative was losing the battle. He made the decision and dealt with the consequences. December 20th, 1944, Bastogne, Belgium. The 101st Airborne Division and elements of the 10th Armoured Division were surrounded in the town, a critical road junction that controlled access to the Meuse River. German forces demanded their surrender. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, commanding the American forces, replied with a single word: nuts. The response became legendary, a symbol of American determination. But the reality inside Bastogne was desperate. The defenders were outnumbered 4-1. Artillery ammunition was running low. Medical supplies were exhausted. Casualties were mounting. German forces shelled the town constantly. The weather was so bad that air resupply was impossible. Unless Third Army broke through, Bastogne would fall and the road to the Meuse would be open. Everything depended on Patton keeping his promise to attack on December 22nd. Patton did. Third Army disengaged from operations in the Saar, moved 90 degrees north, and attacked into the southern shoulder of the German penetration. 250,000 troops redeployed in 72 hours, moving through snow and ice on congested roads. It was a logistical miracle that only Patton's aggressive leadership and Third Army's discipline made possible. The attack began December 22nd as promised. German forces, surprised by the speed of the American response, fought desperately to contain Third Army's advance. Every village became a battle, every crossroads a fight. Casualties were heavy on both sides, but Patton drove his forces forward relentlessly. On December 26th, elements of the 4th Armoured Division broke through to Bastogne. The siege was lifted. McAuliffe's nuts had been vindicated. The southern shoulder of the Bulge was stabilising. But the crisis was not over. German forces continued pushing west, though more slowly now as Allied reserves arrived. SS Panzer forces reached within 4 miles of the Meuse River before being stopped by American troops. The weather cleared on December 23rd, allowing Allied aircraft to attack German supply columns. Thousands of Allied fighters and bombers struck targets throughout the Bulge. German panzer divisions, running out of fuel, became stationary targets. By late December, the German offensive was stalling. Hitler refused to admit defeat, ordering continued attacks long after any chance of success had vanished. German casualties mounted as elite SS divisions were ground down in futile assaults. By January 1st, 1945, the Battle of the Bulge was effectively over. German forces began withdrawing to avoid encirclement. The great gamble had failed. The cost was staggering. American casualties in the Battle of the Bulge: 19,000 killed, 47,500 wounded, 23,000 missing or captured. Total American casualties, 89,500. British casualties, approximately 2,000. German casualties, somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000, including 12,000 killed, 800 German tanks destroyed. Germany's last offensive capability was gone. The panzer divisions that attacked in December would not be available to defend Germany when Allied forces crossed the Rhine. Hitler's gamble had not just failed, it had destroyed the forces that could have prolonged the war. Eisenhower's instinct had been correct. The Battle of the Bulge was an opportunity, not a disaster. Germany had thrown everything into one final attack and lost. But the battle also revealed problems in Allied intelligence and command. How had German forces massed for a major offensive without being detected? Why were American divisions in the Ardennes so poorly deployed? Why had Montgomery's intelligence assessment been so wrong? Eisenhower ordered a review but did not punish anyone. Intelligence failures happen in war. The important thing was that Allied forces had responded effectively when the attack came. The rapid movement of reserves, the aggressive counterattacks, the stubborn defence at Bastogne all demonstrated that Allied forces could react to unexpected crises. Montgomery would claim publicly that British command had saved the day, poisoning his relationship with American commanders even further. But Eisenhower knew the truth. American forces had borne the brunt of the fighting, and American commanders had organised the response. The alliance had held barely. And the road into Germany was now open. January 7th, 1945, a press conference at Montgomery's headquarters in Belgium. The Battle of the Bulge was over. Allied forces had eliminated the German penetration and restored the front line. American casualties had been severe, nearly 90,000 men. But the victory was clear. German forces had been defeated and pushed back. What should have been a moment of unity instead became the worst crisis in Anglo-American relations since the alliance had formed. Montgomery stood before British and American journalists and delivered remarks that would nearly destroy everything Eisenhower had built. As soon as I saw what was happening, I took certain steps to ensure that, if the Germans got to the Meuse, they would certainly not get over that river, Montgomery said. The implication was unmistakable. British command had saved incompetent American forces from disaster. Montgomery continued, describing how he had tidied up the battlefield and organised the defence after American forces had been routed. He praised the courage of the American soldier in a tone that sounded patronising rather than complimentary. He never mentioned that American forces had held Bastogne without British help. He never acknowledged that Patton's Third Army had relieved Bastogne through aggressive attacks while British forces remained largely in defensive positions. He never credited Bradley or Eisenhower with the rapid movement of reserves that had contained the German offensive. Instead, he created the impression that British leadership had rescued American forces from a catastrophe of their own making. The journalists, particularly the American correspondents, were stunned. They had just spent 3 weeks reporting on American soldiers dying in the Ardennes, and now a British field marshal was claiming credit for their sacrifice. The reaction in the United States was immediate and explosive. American newspapers erupted in fury. The New York Times ran editorials condemning Montgomery's arrogance. The Chicago Tribune called for his removal from any command over American forces. Radio commentators declared that American soldiers had been insulted by a British officer who contributed little to the victory. Politicians in Congress demanded explanations. Why was an American general, Eisenhower, allowing a British subordinate to claim credit for American blood? The crisis reached the White House. Roosevelt, dying of heart disease and exhausted from years of war, was nevertheless forced to address the political firestorm. The alliance that had survived Kasserine Pass, Market Garden, and the Bulge itself was now threatened by a press conference. The crisis at Eisenhower's headquarters was even worse. General Omar Bradley, whose forces had borne the brunt of the German attack and the counteroffensive, was so furious he could barely speak coherently. He told Eisenhower that he would resign rather than serve under Montgomery again. If Montgomery was given command of ground forces, Bradley said, "You'll have to send me home." Other American commanders echoed this sentiment. Patton threatened to go public with his own version of the battle, which would humiliate Montgomery and probably fracture the alliance completely. Eisenhower found himself with an impossible choice. If he supported Montgomery, he would lose his American commanders and face political destruction in Washington. If he rebuked Montgomery publicly, he would create a crisis with Britain that could end the coalition. Either way, the alliance was on the verge of collapse. Eisenhower handled the crisis with the same political sophistication that had defined his command. He did not respond publicly to Montgomery's press conference. He did not issue statements or grant interviews. Instead, he went through diplomatic channels. He drafted 2 cables, carefully calibrated to apply maximum pressure without creating a public confrontation. The first cable went to General George Marshall in Washington, requesting that the combined chiefs of staff choose between him and Montgomery. Eisenhower knew this cable would be shown to British leaders and would make clear that he was prepared to resign rather than accept Montgomery's insubordination. The second cable went to the British chiefs of staff, stating that current command arrangements were unacceptable and that, unless this matter is settled at once, I will request relief from this command. The cables had their intended effect. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, seeing that the alliance was about to fracture, intervened personally. He called Montgomery to London and, in a meeting that witnesses described as brutal, ordered him to apologise to Eisenhower publicly. Montgomery, realising he had gone too far, wrote a letter to Eisenhower that was as close to an apology as his ego would allow. "Dear Ike," the letter began, "I have seen the American papers, and I do not like the articles. I have disturbed you. You know I love working for you." Montgomery went on to praise Eisenhower's leadership and stated that Eisenhower's personal directive to me regarding the battle has been right every time. It was a praise capitulation, carefully worded to sound like friendly correspondence rather than a forced apology, but everyone understood what had happened. Churchill had saved the alliance by forcing Montgomery to back down. But the damage to the relationship was permanent. Eisenhower would never trust Montgomery again. American commanders would never accept Montgomery's authority again. The temporary command arrangement during the Bulge, where Montgomery controlled 2 American armies, would never be repeated. For the remainder of the war, Montgomery would command British and Canadian forces only. American forces would report directly to Bradley, who reported to Eisenhower. The command structure that Montgomery had been fighting for since D-Day, where he would be ground forces commander with all Allied armies under his control, was dead. Montgomery had overplayed his hand at the worst possible moment and lost everything he had been manoeuvring to achieve. Churchill took his own steps to repair the damage. On January 18th, 1945, he addressed the House of Commons and delivered a speech carefully crafted to placate American opinion while supporting Montgomery. "The Battle of the Ardennes was undoubtedly the greatest American battle of the war," Churchill said, "and will, I believe, be regarded as an ever-famous American victory." He praised American soldiers for their courage and noted that British forces had played only a supporting role. It was the opposite of what Montgomery had implied in his press conference. Churchill's speech was broadcast internationally and reprinted in American newspapers. The political crisis began to subside. But the scars remained. American commanders would never forget that Montgomery had tried to steal credit for their soldiers' sacrifice. Eisenhower learned several lessons from the Montgomery crisis. First, that coalition warfare required constant vigilance. Even at the moment of victory, national egos could threaten to tear the alliance apart. Second, that some commanders were more interested in personal glory than in winning the war. Montgomery's press conference served no military purpose. It was pure ego, an attempt to position himself as the saviour of the Allied cause. Third, that political problems sometimes required political solutions. Eisenhower could have relieved Montgomery militarily, but that would have created a worse political crisis. Instead, he applied pressure through diplomatic channels and let Churchill deliver the punishment. It was indirect, subtle, and effective, the kind of hidden-hand leadership that would define Eisenhower's presidency years later. The final outcome of the Montgomery crisis was a complete restructuring of Allied command for the drive into Germany. Montgomery would command 21st Army Group, consisting of British and Canadian armies in northern Germany. Bradley would command 12th Army Group, consisting of American armies in central Germany. Patton's 3rd Army would drive through southern Germany. Each commander would have clear areas of responsibility with no overlap. Eisenhower would coordinate from SHA-F headquarters, but would no longer need to manage the day-to-day friction between Montgomery and American commanders. It was the broad front strategy enforced through command structure. No single commander could dominate. No single national force could claim primary credit. The victory would belong to the coalition, not to any individual general. January 16, 1945. Less than 2 weeks after Montgomery's disastrous press conference, Eisenhower met with Churchill, Roosevelt, and the combined chiefs of staff at Malta. This was the final strategic conference before the Yalta Conference with Stalin. The topic was the final assault on Germany. Montgomery proposed, again, a concentrated thrust under his command. Eisenhower presented his broad front strategy, refined based on the lessons of the Bulge. The combined chiefs sided with Eisenhower. The broad front would continue. Montgomery's strategy, discredited by his handling of Market Garden and his behaviour after the Bulge, was definitively rejected. Eisenhower had won the strategic argument and the political battle. The alliance had survived, though it had come within days of complete collapse. The Montgomery crisis revealed the fundamental tension in Eisenhower's command. He was supreme commander, but his authority depended on political support from both America and Britain. If either nation lost confidence in him, he would be removed. This made every decision a calculation that balanced military necessity against political reality. Sometimes the right military decision was politically impossible. Sometimes the politically necessary decision was militarily suboptimal. Eisenhower's genius was finding the narrow path between these extremes, making decisions that were good enough militarily while being acceptable politically. It was exhausting, frustrating work that left no one completely satisfied, but it kept the alliance together. And keeping the alliance together, Eisenhower believed, was more important than any single battle or any individual general's ego, even his own. February 8th, 1945. Yalta, Crimea. While Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin divided post-war Europe, Eisenhower remained in France, preparing for the final assault on Germany. He was not invited to Yalta. The political leaders would make decisions about occupation zones, spheres of influence, and the post-war order. Eisenhower would implement those decisions militarily. The separation between political and military command was clear and absolute, but the decisions made at Yalta would shape Eisenhower's operational choices in ways he did not yet fully understand. Stalin promised to enter the war against Japan within 3 months of Germany's surrender. In exchange, the Soviets would control Eastern Europe. Germany would be divided into occupation zones, with Berlin, deep inside the Soviet zone, jointly occupied by all 4 powers. These political agreements would force Eisenhower to make military decisions based on post-war politics rather than wartime strategy. March 7th, 1945, Remagen, Germany. American forces of the 9th Armoured Division, advancing through the Rhineland, discovered something extraordinary: a bridge across the Rhine River that was still intact. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen should have been destroyed by retreating German forces. Through confusion, cowardice, or mechanical failure, it had not been. American soldiers charged across the bridge under fire, expecting it to explode at any moment. German engineers frantically tried to detonate demolition charges. The charges failed. Within hours, American forces held both sides of the Rhine. Eisenhower received the news with barely suppressed joy. The Rhine, the greatest natural barrier in Western Europe, had been crossed by accident. He immediately ordered every available unit to exploit the bridgehead. Within days, 8,000 American troops were across the Rhine, establishing a lodgment that could not be eliminated. The Remagen Bridge changed everything. Montgomery had been preparing a massive set-piece crossing of the Rhine in the north, Operation Plunder, with elaborate planning, massive artillery preparation, and airborne drops. Now, American forces were already across the Rhine in the centre of Germany. Patton, seeing the opportunity, launched his own crossing on March 22nd near Oppenheim, south of Mainz. His forces crossed at night with minimal casualties, advancing so rapidly that German commanders did not realise what was happening until Patton's tanks were 10 miles east of the Rhine. Patton called Eisenhower with barely concealed glee. "Brad, for God's sake, tell the world we're across," he said to Bradley. "I want the world to know Third Army made it before Monty starts across." The competitive race that had characterised the campaign since D-Day continued even in the final weeks of the war. Montgomery's Operation Plunder launched on March 23, 1945. It was the most elaborate river crossing in military history. 30 divisions, 3,000 artillery pieces. Largest airborne operation since Market Garden. Churchill attended the operation, watching from a hilltop as Allied forces crossed the Rhine in assault boats. The operation succeeded with relatively light casualties, securing a bridgehead in northern Germany. But the massive preparation looked excessive compared to Patton's rapid crossing. British newspapers proclaimed a great victory. American newspapers pointed out that Patton had crossed with fewer resources and less fuss. The national competition for glory continued even as Germany collapsed. Eisenhower ignored the publicity and focused on the operational reality. Allied forces were across the Rhine, along the entire front. The road into Germany was open, April 4th, 1945. Ohrdruf, Germany. Eisenhower, along with Bradley and Patton, toured a liberated concentration camp. It was the first camp the Western Allies had encountered. The scenes were beyond anything they had imagined. Emaciated prisoners in striped uniforms, barely alive, piles of corpses stacked like firewood, cremation ovens still containing partially burned bodies, mass graves, evidence of systematic murder. Patton, who had seen combat across 2 wars, walked away from the group and vomited. Eisenhower, his face pale, ordered every American unit within 50 miles to tour the camp. He ordered photographers and journalists to document everything. He ordered German civilians from nearby towns to be brought to the camp to see what had been done in their name. "We are told the American soldier does not know what he is fighting for," Eisenhower said. "Now, at least, he will know what he is fighting against." The liberation of the camps continued through April. Buchenwald on April 11th, Bergen-Belsen on April 15th, Dachau on April 29th. Each camp revealed new horrors. The systematic murder of Jews, political prisoners, homosexuals, disabled people, and anyone the Nazi regime deemed undesirable. The scale was incomprehensible. Millions dead. Industrial killing on a scale that defied belief. Eisenhower's documentation order ensured that the world would see the evidence. Photographs were distributed to newspapers worldwide. Film footage was shown in newsreels. Congressional delegations were invited to tour the camps. German civilians were forced to bury the dead. Eisenhower understood that future generations might doubt such atrocities had occurred. The evidence had to be preserved and disseminated widely. The Holocaust was not a side effect of war. It was the reason the war had to be fought. April 12, 1945, President Franklin Roosevelt died of a cerebral hemorrhage at Warm Springs, Georgia. He was 63 years old. He had led America through the Great Depression and most of World War II. He had built the alliance with Churchill and Stalin. He had selected Eisenhower to command Allied forces in Europe. His death shocked the Allied leadership. Vice President Harry Truman, who had been president for less than 3 months and had barely been briefed on major war decisions, now commanded American forces. Eisenhower sent condolences but continued operations. There was no time to pause. German forces were collapsing. The end of the war was weeks away. But Roosevelt's death meant Eisenhower had lost his most important political patron. Truman was an unknown quantity. Eisenhower would have to prove himself all over again. April 15, 1945. Eisenhower made the most controversial military decision of the war. American forces would not race the Soviets to Berlin. He announced this decision in a cable to Stalin, coordinating the final advance into Germany. American forces would halt at the Elbe River, approximately 60 miles west of Berlin. Soviet forces, advancing from the east, would take the German capital. Churchill was furious. He demanded that Western forces capture Berlin before the Soviets to prevent Soviet domination of Central Europe. British commanders wanted the glory of taking Hitler's capital, but Eisenhower's logic was cold and practical. Taking Berlin would cost approximately 100,000 casualties. The city was heavily defended, street fighting would be brutal, and the Yalta Agreement had already assigned Berlin to the Soviet occupation zone. Why spend American lives capturing a city that would be turned over to the Soviets anyway? The decision to bypass Berlin was military but had profound political consequences. Soviet forces did capture Berlin, and Stalin claimed the symbolic victory over Nazism. The Soviets occupied Eastern Europe and would not leave for another 45 years. The Cold War began, in part, because Western forces did not contest Soviet control of Berlin and Eastern Europe. Historians would debate for decades whether Eisenhower made the right choice. Churchill believed the decision was naive, that Eisenhower did not understand the political importance of occupying territory before negotiating post-war arrangements. Eisenhower believed that military operations should be based on military logic, not post-war politics. Soldiers should not die for political advantage. The argument would never be fully resolved. But in April 1945, Eisenhower made his choice and accepted the consequences. American forces continued advancing into southern and central Germany. They liberated Munich, captured Nuremberg, pushed into Austria. Patton's Third Army advanced so rapidly that German forces could not establish defensive lines. Entire cities surrendered without fighting. German soldiers, realizing the war was lost, surrendered by the tens of thousands. But some units, particularly SS forces, fought to the end. Hitler, in his bunker in Berlin, ordered non-existent armies to counterattack. He declared that Germany would fight to the last man. He blamed his generals for the defeat. He committed suicide on April 30th rather than face capture. With Hitler dead, German resistance finally collapsed. What had been an army became a mob of refugees trying to surrender to American forces rather than Soviets. The war was ending not with a dramatic battle, but with exhaustion and collapse. The moral weight of victory pressed on Eisenhower constantly. He walked through destroyed German cities, seeing civilians living in rubble. He saw millions of displaced persons, concentration camp survivors, and slave labourers wandering across Germany with nowhere to go. He saw German prisoners of war, hundreds of thousands of them, being held in temporary camps because there was nowhere to send them. The destruction was total. Germany had been reduced to ruins. And Eisenhower had ordered much of that destruction. The bombing campaigns, the artillery barrages, the advancing armies, all had been necessary to defeat Nazi Germany. But the human cost was visible everywhere. Europe had destroyed itself. Millions were dead. Economies were shattered. Cities were gone. And now came the task of building peace from the wreckage of total war. It was not a task Eisenhower had trained for, but it was the task that awaited him. April 30th, 1945, 3:30 in the afternoon, Berlin, Germany. Adolf Hitler placed a pistol in his mouth and pulled the trigger. His wife, Eva Braun, whom he had married the previous day, took cyanide. Their bodies were carried to the garden of the Reich Chancellery, doused with gasoline and set on fire. The man who had started World War II, who had ordered the Holocaust, who had brought devastation to Europe, was dead by his own hand. In his political testament, Hitler blamed everyone but himself. The generals who failed him, the German people who were unworthy of his leadership, the Jews who he believed controlled the world. He remained a fanatic to the end, incapable of accepting responsibility for the catastrophe he had created. His death was not heroic or dignified. It was pathetic, a dictator shooting himself in a bunker while the empire he built collapsed around him. The German military command structure fractured immediately. Hitler had named Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz as his successor. Dönitz, realizing the war was lost, sought to negotiate surrender terms that would allow German forces in the east to retreat westward and surrender to American or British forces rather than Soviets. He hoped to split the alliance, to create conditions where Western allies would turn against the Soviet Union. Eisenhower saw through the strategy immediately. There would be no separate peace. Germany would surrender unconditionally to all allies simultaneously. Any attempt to play east against west would be rejected. The alliance that had fought together would accept surrender together. Eisenhower communicated this position to Dönitz through intermediaries. Germany could surrender or continue fighting. There was no third option. May 7th, 1945, 0241 hours, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, Reims, France. German Chief of Staff General Alfred Jodl signed the instrument of unconditional surrender. The war in Europe was over. Germany had been defeated. The Third Reich, which Hitler had boasted would last 1,000 years, had lasted 12. Eisenhower refused to meet with the German representatives. He sent his Chief of Staff, General Walter Bedell Smith, to accept the surrender. After the signing, Eisenhower allowed Jodl and Admiral Hans-Georg von Friedeberg to enter his office briefly. He asked a single question: "Do you understand the terms of the surrender?" They confirmed they did. Eisenhower responded, "You will be held responsible if the terms are violated." The Germans left. Eisenhower had no interest in dramatic confrontations or ceremonial moments. The surrender was a business transaction, the formal end of a criminal regime. But the Soviets were not satisfied with the Reims surrender. Stalin demanded a second ceremony in Berlin, in the Soviet occupation zone, to legitimize Soviet participation in Germany's defeat. The Western Allies agreed. On May 8, 1945, just before midnight, a second surrender ceremony was held at Soviet military headquarters in Karlshorst, a suburb of Berlin. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel signed for Germany. Marshal Georgy Zhukov signed for the Soviet Union. Air Chief Marshal Arthur Tedder, Eisenhower's deputy, signed for the Western Allies. The dual surrenders satisfied all parties, though they revealed the growing tensions within the alliance. The Soviets wanted recognition for their sacrifices on the Eastern Front. The Western Allies wanted credit for liberating Western Europe. Both got their ceremonies, both got their moment of triumph, but the celebration masked the reality that the alliance was already fraying. May 8th, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. Across America, Britain, France, and other Allied nations, people poured into the streets, celebrating. In London, crowds gathered at Buckingham Palace cheering for King George VI and Winston Churchill. In New York, Times Square filled with jubilant crowds. In Paris, liberated less than a year earlier, French citizens celebrated with a joy that came from survival. The war in Europe was over. Nazi Germany was defeated. The concentration camps were liberated. The threat to civilization had been eliminated. But at his headquarters in Reims, Eisenhower did not celebrate. He drafted a cable to the combined chiefs of staff. The cable was characteristically understated, devoid of drama or self-promotion. The mission of this Allied force was fulfilled at 0241, local time, the 7th of May, 1945. 21 words to describe the greatest military victory in history. The casualties of the war were almost incomprehensible. German military deaths, 5.5 million. Soviet military deaths, 8.5 to 10 million. British military deaths, 383,000. American military deaths, 417,000. French military deaths, 210,000. Civilian deaths across Europe, estimates range from 15 to 20 million, with at least 6 million Jews murdered in the Holocaust, cities destroyed, economies shattered, entire populations displaced. The victory was real, but so was the cost. Eisenhower understood that the numbers were not statistics. They were individuals, each with families and futures that had been extinguished. The weight of those deaths would stay with him for the rest of his life. The immediate post-surrender period brought new challenges that Eisenhower had not anticipated. Millions of displaced persons filled Germany, former prisoners and slave labourers from across Europe who had nowhere to go. Their home countries were destroyed or under Soviet occupation. Feeding them, housing them, and eventually repatriating them became a massive humanitarian operation. German prisoners of war, numbered in the millions, held in temporary camps with inadequate food and shelter. German civilians were starving, their ration system collapsed, their economy non-existent. Eisenhower, who had spent 5 years planning military operations, now had to become a governor, managing occupied territory, coordinating relief efforts, and preventing epidemics. It was not a role he wanted or was trained for, but it was the role thrust upon him. June 10th, 1945, Eisenhower travelled to Moscow at Stalin's invitation. The Soviet dictator hosted a victory banquet for Allied commanders. Vodka flowed freely. Toasts were given constantly, each more effusive than the last. Stalin toasted Eisenhower, praising his leadership and the Allied victory. Eisenhower toasted Stalin, acknowledging Soviet sacrifices on the Eastern Front. But beneath the diplomatic pleasantries, Eisenhower saw the reality of Soviet power. Stalin was consolidating control over Eastern Europe, installing communist governments in Poland, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. The countries liberated from Nazi occupation were now under Soviet occupation. Churchill's warnings about Soviet expansion, which Eisenhower had dismissed during the war, were proving accurate. The alliance that had defeated Hitler was already splitting into what would become the Cold War. Eisenhower's appointment as military governor of the U.S. occupation zone in Germany made him responsible for governing 40 million Germans in a devastated country. He had to rebuild infrastructure, restart the economy, establish legal systems, conduct war crimes, trials, and implement denazification policies. Every decision had consequences. Should former Nazi party members be allowed to work? How strictly should denazification be enforced? How much should the German economy be restricted to prevent rearmament? How should German society be rebuilt? These were political and moral questions that had no clear answers. Eisenhower, the military commander, found himself making decisions about governance, justice, and reconstruction. It was exhausting, frustrating work that showed him how military victory did not automatically create lasting peace. The Nuremberg trials, which began in November 1945, put Nazi leadership on trial for war crimes, crimes against peace, and crimes against humanity. Eisenhower supported the trials but did not attend. He believed justice should be served, but he also believed that vengeance was not justice. The trials would establish precedents for international law and hold individuals accountable for atrocities committed during war, but they would not heal the wounds or bring back the dead. Eisenhower understood that the real test would be whether Germany could be transformed from a totalitarian state into a democratic society. That transformation would take years, perhaps decades. It was not a task that could be accomplished through military occupation alone. It required political will, economic investment, and cultural change. Eisenhower could begin the process, but he could not complete it. By late 1945, Eisenhower was exhausted. He had commanded Allied forces for 3.5 years. He had managed coalition warfare across multiple theatres. He had made decisions that affected millions of lives. He had won the greatest military victory in history. But he had also learned that victory creates new problems, as complex as those solved by winning. The alliance with the Soviet Union was collapsing. Europe was in ruins. Millions were displaced, starving, or homeless. The peace he had fought to achieve looked increasingly fragile, and the general, who had never wanted to be a politician, was now deeply embedded in politics, making decisions about governance and diplomacy that would shape the post-war world. The war was over. But Eisenhower's service and his education in the cost of leadership was far from complete. November 1945, Frankfurt, Germany. General Dwight Eisenhower, now military governor of the U.S. occupation zone, sat in his headquarters dealing with problems that seemed impossible to solve. 7 million Germans were homeless, living in rubble, food production had collapsed, the German economy had ceased to function, former Nazis claimed they had been forced to join the party, actual Nazi criminals were hiding or fleeing. Soviet forces in the Eastern Zone were stripping factories and shipping entire industrial facilities back to Russia. The Cold War was beginning, though it did not yet have a name. Eisenhower, who had spent his entire adult life in uniform preparing for war, now found himself trying to create peace. The transition was difficult. War had clear objectives and defined enemies. Peace was ambiguous, full of moral complications and political trade-offs that made military command look simple by comparison. Eisenhower served as military governor for only 6 months before being recalled to Washington. In November 1945, President Truman appointed him Chief of Staff of the Army, replacing George Marshall. Eisenhower did not want the job. He wanted to retire, to spend time with his wife Mamie, to escape the pressure that had defined his life since 1941. But Marshall insisted, and Eisenhower could not refuse the man who had made his career possible. As Chief of Staff, Eisenhower presided over the demobilization of the largest military force in American history. 12 million men and women in uniform in 1945, less than 2 million by 1947. The speed of demobilization created chaos, units lost cohesion, training programs collapsed. Equipment was abandoned or sold, The army that had defeated Germany and Japan in 1945 could barely function by 1947. The political pressure on Eisenhower began almost immediately after the war ended. Both political parties wanted him to run for president. He was the most popular man in America, the general who had won the war. He had no political experience, no party affiliation, no public positions on domestic policy, but none of that mattered. Americans trusted him. Polls showed he could win the presidency simply by running. Truman, a Democrat, offered to step aside if Eisenhower wanted the Democratic nomination in 1948. Thomas Dewey, the Republican nominee, offered the Republican nomination. Eisenhower refused both. He insisted he was a soldier, not a politician. He had no interest in running for office. He wanted to retire from public life. But the pressure continued building over the next several years, until finally Eisenhower could no longer resist. In 1948, Eisenhower retired from active duty and became president of Columbia University in New York. It should have been a quiet academic position, a dignified retirement for a war hero. Instead, it became another political role. Eisenhower raised money for the university, gave speeches, and found himself constantly pulled into national debates about defense policy, Soviet expansion, and the Marshall Plan for European recovery. He could not escape politics no matter how much he tried. The world would not let him retire. He was too important, too trusted, too valuable. In 1950, when the Korean War began, Truman asked Eisenhower to return to active duty as Supreme Commander of NATO, the new military alliance formed to counter Soviet power in Europe. Eisenhower agreed, knowing that refusing would be seen as abandoning his country. As NATO commander from 1950 to 1952, Eisenhower built the military alliance that would define the Cold War. He convinced European nations to contribute forces. He established command structures. He negotiated with governments. He demonstrated the same coalition management skills that had won World War II. But he also saw that the political situation was deteriorating. Senator Joseph McCarthy was conducting anti-communist witch hunts in America. The Korean War was stalemated. Defense spending was soaring. Nuclear weapons were proliferating. Eisenhower believed American political leadership was failing to manage the Cold War effectively. Slowly, reluctantly, he began to consider that he might need to run for president, not because he wanted to, but because the country needed leadership he believed he could provide. 1952, Eisenhower resigned from NATO and announced his candidacy for the Republican presidential nomination. He defeated Senator Robert Taft, the conservative favorite, in a contentious primary battle. He chose Richard Nixon, a young California senator, as his running mate to balance the ticket. He ran on a platform of ending the Korean War, containing communism without bankrupt remilitarization and bringing honesty to government. He defeated Democratic nominee Adlai Stevenson in a landslide. On January 20th, 1953, Dwight David Eisenhower, the general who had never voted until he was 58 years old, became the 34th President of the United States. He was the first Republican president in 20 years, and the first president since Ulysses S. Grant to have no prior political experience. The general had become politician. The question was whether the skills that made him a great commander would make him a great president. Eisenhower's presidency from 1953 to 1961 was defined by the same qualities that had defined his military command: caution, coalition building, and hidden hand leadership. He ended the Korean War within 6 months, negotiating an armistice that satisfied no one but stopped the killing. He refused to intervene militarily in Vietnam when French forces were defeated at Dien Bien Phu, despite enormous pressure from his own advisors. He managed the Cold War without starting World War III, surviving crises in Berlin, Hungary, Suez, and Cuba. He built the interstate highway system, which transformed American infrastructure. He sent federal troops to Little Rock, Arkansas, to enforce school desegregation, though he did so reluctantly and without the moral passion civil rights leaders wanted. He warned, in his farewell address, about the military-industrial complex that was distorting American democracy. But Eisenhower's presidency was also criticized for what he did not do. He did not confront McCarthy until the senator's accusations became so reckless they threatened the army. He did not provide strong leadership on civil rights, allowing the movement to build without presidential support. He did not explain his foreign policy to the American public, preferring secret diplomacy to public advocacy. He cultivated an image of being above politics, a benign grandfather figure who played golf while his staff managed the government. Historians initially rated his presidency as mediocre, criticizing his passivity and lack of vision. Only later, when presidential archives were opened and scholars could see his private papers, did they realize that Eisenhower's apparent passivity masked sophisticated political maneuvering. He had been pulling strings all along, managing crises through indirect action rather than dramatic pronouncements. The debate over Eisenhower's leadership style, both military and presidential, has continued for decades. Was he a brilliant strategist who understood that coalition management and political sophistication were more important than battlefield tactics? Or was he a cautious compromiser who prolonged wars and missed opportunities because he valued harmony over decisiveness? Did the broad front strategy save the alliance or extend the war? Did bypassing Berlin prevent casualties or surrender Eastern Europe to Soviet domination? Did his presidency prevent World War III or allow communism to expand? The questions have no definitive answers. History is not a laboratory where alternative strategies can be tested. But what can be said with certainty is that Eisenhower's approach, for better or worse, shaped the world we inherited. Eisenhower returned to Normandy beaches every decade on D-Day anniversaries. In 1964, at the 20th anniversary, he gave a television interview standing on Omaha Beach. The interviewer asked if he had doubts about the decision to launch the invasion on June 6th. Eisenhower's eyes welled with tears. "That question is one that will live with me as long as I live," he said. "I have been back here 11 times since D-Day, trying to reanalyze all the decisions, particularly as they might affect the lives of the men, trying to see how we could have done anything different." The emotion was raw and real. 20 years later, the weight of command was still visible on his face. The decision to say "let's go" on that stormy morning had been the right decision. But it still haunted him. The men who died on those beaches had trusted him. Some of that trust had been rewarded with victory. Some had been rewarded with white crosses in Normandy cemeteries. Eisenhower died on March 28, 1969, after a series of heart attacks. He was 78 years old. He had lived to see America land men on the moon, fulfilling the technological ambitions that had driven the Cold War. He had lived to see the civil rights movement transform American society, though more slowly than its advocates wanted. He had lived to see Vietnam become the quagmire he had predicted and avoided. He was buried in Abilene, Kansas, the small town where he had grown up, in a simple uniform with no medals, as he had requested. His funeral was attended by dignitaries from around the world, but also by ordinary Americans who remembered him as the general who had won World War II and the president who had kept the peace. His legacy was complicated, debated, and enduring. The story of Dwight Eisenhower is not the story of a great tactical genius or a battlefield hero. He never fought in combat. He never commanded troops under fire. His reputation was built not on winning battles, but on managing coalitions, balancing competing interests, and making decisions that kept imperfect alliances together long enough to achieve victory. He understood that modern warfare was as much political as military, that strategic thinking required understanding how nations related to each other, not just how armies fought. He succeeded because he never let ego interfere with necessity, never confused personal glory with strategic objectives, and never forgot that his job was to win the war, not to be loved or admired. The uncertain general who never heard a shot fired in anger became the commander who launched D-Day, held the alliance together, and shaped the post-war world. History has struggled to categorize him, to decide if he was brilliant or lucky, cautious or wise. Perhaps the best answer is that he was what the moment required. A leader who understood that winning was more important than glory, that coalition was more important than command, and that the loneliest decisions were the ones that mattered most.